not just a setback. And we had started to identify there are some of these locations, and why I think it's important to have this both of these in place. We did an analysis of all of the properties abutting 82nd Avenue for from Killingsworth to the city limits Clatsop to understand what the current estimated, and I have to emphasize estimates because it's based on what we have in GIS, and it's not always survey exact. But we estimated what would be the current dedication under current requirements, and what would it be under the proposed requirements, and what is the difference between that two? What additional dedication would we be requesting through the development process? And these maps will then display that for all of the properties. Zero in just to highlight one example here. This is 82nd between Holiday and Hasselo. The photo shows what the looks like on the sidewalk in the street there at the Taco Time. And the measurements that we did showed that under current standards, we would ask for an 8-foot dedication because it is in a pedestrian district and we want to already go to the 15 feet to meet our standards. With the right-of-way dedication proposed change to go to the 45 feet from center line, it would be 8.9, so that's the third number, an additional roughly 1 foot, 0.9 feet estimate of additional right-of-way. And then that varies along the corridor, or you can see it even across the street. But I want to make sure that understand this dedication can help us get from what you see here in the photo more to something like this that you see here existing at the McDonald's up the street.
April, a question if you don't mind.
Yes.
Just try to wrap my head around this, and are there comparable examples you could point me to of City of Portland streets that have a 90-foot right-of-way?
That is a good question. Certainly some of the East Portland arterials that have 5 lanes are approaching 90 or 100 feet of right-of-way because they have bike lanes and on-street parking and sidewalks. And so this, that might be somewhat of a proxy.
So 122nd,
Powell,
for example?
Powell could be an example. 122nd is, in that realm. I think this is actually,
Which is a street we're trying to put on a road diet, right? So is 90 actually desirable, or is that a legacy of dealing with the fact that this was a former state highway?
I think that 90 is desirable, and I think that there's a lot that we can do in 90 feet starting today with wider sidewalk corridors, which is, I think, a demonstrated need now. And we want to seek that opportunity as we can as development occurs. And in the future, it creates the opportunity for us to come back and think about what might we do with that cross-section in the future, which would need additional planning, and is a recommendation in our Next Steps chapter to, in time, seek to do a more comprehensive concept design and looking at the street.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So April, does that conclude what you had?
It does, yes.
Great, because I'm concerned
thank
about
you.
time here a little bit. So if there's other questions, if we could kind of try to get through those quickly, then we'll take testimony and have deliberations. I see Ben's hand up, and Mike's hand up, Daisy's hand up.
Well, you had me at street trees. I'm wondering, though, with increased imperviousness, which is what I'm hearing, I guess somewhat complementary to Chris's comment, what are you doing with regard to working with BES to deal with additional stormwater issues?
So given the curb is in place and there's a drainage system in place, I don't believe that development is triggering the stormwater management manual and providing stormwater facilities today through the development process, because that curb is remaining and it's already existing. So in terms, I don't know the full answer if there's other things that is happening with BES as development occurs that would need to want to consult with them, because this is largely through the development process that we're talking about. But typically that's the case if the curb is in place and it's not moving. But that said, this could be that street trees as well as more of a planter strip could be a possibility to help reduce that runoff. If we jump here to the concept drawing, particularly the one on the bottom shows more of a planter strip. The top one is more of an urban setting where we'd have more tree wells, but there could be exploration of that to be a more planter strip to reduce the impervious.
Yeah, it just seems like a great opportunity for a retrofit to deal with more of the stormwater with green infrastructure.
That could be an opportunity. Yeah.
Ben and Daisy?
A couple of questions, clarifications. The first one is connected to Chris's comment. I'm assuming as part of this, you also looked at the width of the current lanes to determine whether we needed to actually go for the 90-foot right away. I mean, I certainly get the 12th and the 15th with sidewalks, but have you looked at perhaps gaining that room inward, and perhaps since it's also a high crash corridor, perhaps maybe slow down the speed of the cars themselves? Potentially that's an issue. Second question connected to Mike's question as far as tree goes. My understanding is that we're setting the right-of-way up for potential street furnishing zone improvement, including trees, but that would be up to street improvements, frontage improvements when development occurs? Or is there also a portion of the plan that looks into potential furnishing zone improvements?
Key to getting those furnishing zone improvements is having the right of way to do so. And so I would say that has not been a focus of the capital improvement side, but more of as the dedication to get the right of way to create a true furnishing zone. There could be then additional looking at what could be done with that. So if you have particular suggestions, trying to ride that balance between increasing the dedication to get that which is ample, but not overwhelming what is required of development. So maintain that proportionality, if you will. But once that space is there, if you meant through the development process or more specifically a capital project, but yeah, we're mostly focused on the development side for this one. That said, we have received feedback that there are some spots for some sidewalk where there's still not even a sidewalk built, or there's such a narrow sidewalk it's not functioning, of looking at adding those to our capital improvement side. So I am taking that into consideration as we revise the plan to add some segments to build sidewalk where there's not likely to be development. Marty, would you like to speak to that very briefly?
I'm a little bit concerned about time.
Okay.
I think you covered that pretty well. Did that answer your question, Ben?
It did.
Okay, thank
The
you.
first question, though, I realized I did not get to. So I did look at ways that you may change the width of lanes or move the curb inward. However, I think it's important to highlight that this is a state-owned facility, and that is not our jurisdiction today. We have jurisdiction from the curb out in terms of the sidewalk corridor. So today it's our sidewalk standards that are being applied, and we have the jurisdiction to change that. To move the curb, that's ODOT's jurisdiction, and moving the curb inward would not meet their current standards and would require many design exceptions, and so it's something that is not in this plan at this time. We're working on those incremental improvements that we can do and start to take action on. That could be a future exploration.
Thank you. Daisy?
I just have a quick question back to the equity analysis. The 36%, it's 36% people of color who reside there currently. Do we have any demographic information on the people who work on 82nd or demographic info on business owners along 82nd?
Not at this time. There is definitely a desire to get more of that information, but we don't quite have the data sources to access it right now. when we were doing more of the equity analysis on the split zone sites and looking at that, there was actually quite a bit of information that we became very hungry for, but it would really require kind of a direct door-to-door survey as far as getting that information.
Are there additional questions? If not, I'd like to open it up to testimony. Thank you both.
Thank you.
I will give you a heads up. After testimony, I am going to, in particular, ask about this letter from John Mulvey and your opinions of the suggestions that were included in that. So, for testimony today, again, if you're here to testify and have not yet filled out a testimony card, please do so and bring them up to Love here. At the moment, we have 3 individuals who would like to testify. I'll go ahead and call all 3 of you up right now. It's Terry. That's Terry Parker, Doug Klotz, and Peter Fry. Letter from John Mulvey and your opinions of this. Seem to have a feedback loop somewhere. Welcome. Thank you. Go ahead, Terry.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Terry Parker. I live in Northeast Portland. Built as a state highway, 82nd Avenue is the only north-south surface street in the mid part of East Portland that extends from an area near the Columbia River all the way through to Clackamas County. Today, 82nd Avenue is a high-volume motor vehicle street, a frequent transit service street, and often utilized by emergency vehicles. On page 29 of the draft 82nd Avenue plan, the proposed right-of-way dedication requirements within non-pedestrian districts is to provide 45 feet of public right-of-way from each side of the center line, or a minimum of 12 feet behind the existing curb line, whichever is greater. The same overall 90-foot right-of-way dedication requirements apply within the pedestrian districts, but with 15-foot sidewalks behind the curb line. Having the same overall right-of-way requirements, 90 feet for both types of districts, allows the sidewalk space in the pedestrian districts to encroach 6 feet into the roadway right-of-way, thereby narrowing the motor vehicle travel lanes to unsafe substandard widths. With that encroachment, constricting travel lanes, visibility for drivers is decreased, and there is an increased probability of a motor vehicle crash jumping the curb, thereby degrading safety for both pedestrians and drivers alike. Planning for narrow lanes in pedestrian districts will also create more congestion, add to fuel consumption, and thereby increase carbon emissions. The right-of-way dedication requirements within pedestrian districts needs to be modified to provide for a minimum of 66 feet on the roadway between the curbs, or 48 feet of public right-of-way from each side of the center line, for a total of 96 feet to accommodate the 15-foot sidewalks behind the curb line. This adjustment is absolutely necessary to ensure that all motor vehicle lanes and left turn pockets, often located on 82nd Avenue and pedestrian districts, are wide enough, 13 feet, to safely accommodate large emergency vehicles, freight and semi-trucks, and transit buses that are 10 feet 6 inches wide mirror to mirror, ensuring travel lane widths that allow large vehicles to safely pass a bus stopped for passengers also dovetails with a recent Metro Commission poll where the public, which you should be representing, has said they want wider roads and increased motor vehicle capacity to reduce congestion. Additionally, any new residential development in the corridor needs to have adequate off-street parking so neighborhood streets do not become car storage lots. City surveys have clearly demonstrated that 72% of households in new multifamily developments have 1 or more cars. Therefore, the sweet spot requirement should be 3 parking places for every 4 residential units. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Hi, I'm Doug Klotz. I urge you to adopt the 82nd Avenue study. The employment zoning seems useful, and the split zoning, that makes sense too. The changes in how the right-of-way is dedicated will reduce anomalies that occur now under the current regimen and will give us adequate space for sidewalks and street trees. The barriers to development section does call out a lot of problems, and it is going to be difficult to get from where we are now, where property owners feel they need large parking lots, to a more pedestrian-friendly buildings up near the sidewalk design. So I hope we can get there. I welcome going to the PBOT section here, with the right-of-way width again. I think that the curb is still going to remain the same. We're not going to be narrowing the lanes, just leaving them where they are at this point. And I welcome the 15 new protected corridors and improvements to the existing ones, and hope they'll reduce the number of crashes on 82nd. Now, as far as the future, when there's jurisdictional transfer, then we can move the curves in. And I have seen some drawings that staff has done that also looked at how we could fit bike facilities within this right-of-way, which would include, bikes sort of in the Netherlands model with the bike lanes on the sidewalk, well, next to the sidewalk, but out, on the other side of the street trees. So the street trees would have a zone of their own, and then a bike facility, and then a sidewalk. And I think this would be better, because you would be moving the curb out so you get a wider planting area, and then you'd have enough room for both of those within that 15 feet. And I think this would also get room for more busy street life, like you see in Asian cities and Latin American cities. Even in Los Angeles, where bicycle vendors with ice cream tubs is something I see all the time there. So it makes sense to have the bicycle and pedestrian facilities in a wider area, nearer the buildings. And I hope that we can get to that point. And this is just the first step. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Peter Finley Fry.
Excuse me, Peter, your mic does not appear to be on.
I'm not very technical. Okay.
Oh, you got it now.
Yeah.
You're more technical than you guessed.
Thank you.
Lights don't work.
I'm Peter Finley Fry, planning consultant. I'm here on behalf of my client, the Fubon supermarket. The market owns what used to be Portland Community College property, and I've given you maps of that. We are the largest Asian shopping center in the state of Oregon. We employ over 120 people. Most importantly, the marketplace provides locations for affordable retail spaces. So we have over 29 small businesses in addition to the supermarket and a Starbucks and other things that are out on the frontage there. We serve approximately 1 million people a year. We right now, all our access goes straight out onto 82nd. And so we've been working with PBOD and ODOT, hate to use acronyms, but I know you know them, to try to figure out how we can get a better access to the marketplace and maybe move some of the cars to the back and enhance the pedestrian frontage. We do have a traffic signal. It's complicated because it provides walking and vehicle access into the site. We are very strongly in support of the plan. Obviously, when I say we, I'm really meaning my client. It's a matter of speaking, but they have built apartment buildings in the area. They are heavily invested in this area, and they need the city's help to make this thing work. I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to make one quick comment. In reading the report, the largest load of TriMet is 82nd Avenue bus. Yet at the same time, 2 of the segments are in the top 10, 11 for pedestrian delays. So if you think about that, here you are, you got your largest bus demand, and you've got 2 of the largest segment delays. So something's got to be fixed there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. If there's anybody else here to testify, please come on up. I am not seeing any, therefore we'll close oral testimony. And if staff could come back up, please, so we could take some questions before deliberation. Are there any, from anybody else, additional questions for staff? Go ahead, Andre.
Before you get too far down the road, will you do a displacement analysis of the businesses and of the potential, if you do this work, would it displace businesses? I mean, and there's an analysis that can be done there. I'm just asking if it's going to be done or not.
So we did do, I would say, a very high level economic and equity impact analysis that was in the February 7th staff report. I think, we used data that we had access to at the time. I think the question is to what scale are we going to do this work? And I think that, as I mentioned regarding Daisy's question, I think in order to do a very deep dive into looking at anti-displacement of businesses, you need to have staff on the ground actually going and talking to the businesses. And right now, this project does not have the staffing capacity to do so. And so that's something that I think we would really like to be incorporated into thinking and methodology and scoping of when we are doing planning work. And this is something that I would very much like to inform the anti-displacement plan that is a budget item that we're proposing. So I don't know if that answered your question, Andre, but.
So we're going to make a recommendation today. Is that something, I guess, at the end of the day, that we as a commission could recommend as part of this should be done? That detailed.
So I think regarding the actual map changes, I think the feeling from the staff that conducted both the economic and equity impact analysis, that those changes do not warrant that level of analysis because the changes are not a significant upzone, if that makes sense. These are technical fixes. With that said, I think that there is a spectrum of thought on what should warrant that deep dive analysis. Okay.
Are there any other questions? So I do have a question with regards to this letter. There were some recommendations that were made. I'd like to get kind of staff's opinion on those recommendations to be added to the proposal.
Okay. Do you want to start and then I'll supplement?
Yeah. So, and really it's the last page of Mr. Mulvey's testimony. And I am, again, very appreciative. I've had a lot of informal question or conversations with John, and I'm very appreciative of him submitting testimony. Regarding the near-term action, as far as the integrating a residential displacement risk analysis into all significant transportation, zoning, and economic development plans and infrastructure per comp plan policies, I feel like I think there's a number of ways of responding to that. I think that there's significant residential displacement risk analysis that's been done with the residential infill project that is very much tied to 82nd Avenue. The fact that there are Cully, Montevilla, Palhurst, Gilbert, Brentwood, Darlington, and Lentz that all are up and down the corridor, and that analysis has been done. I feel like there could be a bit better of a crosswalk with that analysis and how it is discussed in the 82nd Avenue plan. So that's, I guess, my thought there. Regarding the develop a corridor-wide residential growth strategy, I think it's an excellent idea. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay.
And then regarding the comments regarding the mitigating homelessness impacts and just the choice of language, I think what's tricky about that is that was language that was pulled from the Leland Consulting report that came specifically from property owners and business owners. So it is qualitative data, which is one perspective of many on a very complicated issue and how we respond to communities experiencing houselessness. So I feel like it would be good for us to look at that section again. But I think maybe create a little bit more of a caveat on who that perspective is from.
Seems fair. Okay. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could follow up on those points a little bit. So in terms of residential displacement risk, it seems to me there are basically two actions here, right? We're making some technical improvements to employment zoning that may increase employment density, right? If things go well, and we're making a lot of safety improvements to the street. Taking the second one, I could imagine that if we make the street safer, it becomes more desirable, and that could be a driver of displacement. On the other hand, I can't imagine withholding safety improvements in order to stop displacement. That would be completely unfair to the existing population. So I'm not going to go there. But let me ask the question, do you see any cross risk where increasing employment density could be a driver of residential displacement, or are they sufficiently decoupled?
I feel at this time, again, with the employment zoning, again, it's not an up zone. It's just a straight across. It doesn't create increased development capacity. I also feel like zoning is just one part of what allows development to occur. And in this study, there are significant barriers to just lack of sophistication of property owners, not across the board, but that just is one item. Lack of access to financing. Also, I think there's a whole part of what I would have loved if I had been involved in the study a little bit earlier. I would have loved to really explore where the barriers are with financing and why we can't get 2 or 3 story or 4-story buildings financed on 82nd. And then additionally, there's this whole barrier that is a little bit of the elephant in the room, and that is city barriers as far as SDCs and what are our city requirements. You know, when a property is going through, for example, we have a lot of properties that totally avoid triggering that non-conforming upgrade threshold because they just can't afford it. And so that's why we don't see like the hung fat site or, you know, other sites when there was a change and a new tenant improvement, we're not seeing landscaping going in parking lots because people are avoiding that threshold. So I feel like the zoning piece is such a small component of many, 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 many other barriers that are here along the corridor.
Are there any other questions for Stowe? If not, does anybody want to make a motion? And perhaps, Marty, I believe you have a slide for a potential motion.
Okay. How would you like me to, do you want me to read through these, or what's your protocol?
Oh, I think we could all read it. Okay. Is anybody comfortable making a motion to? So move to recommend amending the zoning map. Yes, there's 2 options, I believe, here. One is to revise them.
I think.
Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you're putting in front of us? Sorry.
We actually have, I guess, technically 4 actions. You know, first, it's more directing staff to revise the 82nd Avenue study to include the economic and equity impact analysis that was done in the February 7th staff report. So we would incorporate that into the study. Number 2 would be to direct staff to revise both the 82nd Avenue study and the 82nd Avenue plan to clarify information proposals as necessary. So that gives us a little bit of more room to make those not content edits, but more technical edits for clarity. And then moving down below, recommend that City Council, number 1, amend the zoning map and the comprehensive plan map as shown in the staff reports dated both February 7th and March 7th. And then number 2, adopt by resolution the 82nd Avenue study and then the 82nd Avenue plan.
Great. Okay, so Mike, you were moving all 4 points. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Second.
And we have a second. Is there any further discussion, questions, deliberation? Andre?
Yeah, I'm supportive of this plan because of the safety what it's going to do for 82nd. I think the residents need 82nd to function better from a pedestrian standpoint, from a safety standpoint. But what they don't need is a plan that gets better safety and then the businesses disappear because saying zoning's not a driver. We change zoning all the time, streetcar being an example, to change the neighborhood to get more businesses. So zoning is a driver, and we are changing it. We're making it easier for zoning for people to develop, and the restriction from getting smaller frontage is going to make it easier to develop. It doesn't increase the zoning, but it makes it easier. And that's, you have residents that are not sophisticated, you're correct, but we don't have policies to go out and help those residents redevelop.
That's right.
And so those are ethnic businesses that are at some point, they get bought up and someone else redevelops them. It is an additive effect of the businesses and the residents at risk. And we need to take a look at it. I get Portland doesn't want to take a look at it, but ODOT controls the street, and I hope ODOT holds Portland to the equity components of the comp plan and says, how are you going to mitigate the people that get displaced because of this action? And so if we don't do it, let somebody else can hold our feet to the fire here, because the businesses are connected to the residents. And we heard the business come up and say they do 1 million residents or customers a year. That's a big population. I suspect it's mostly local, and we need to be able to support them, not put in place something that's going to push them out and push the residents out. So while I'm supportive, I wish we could recommend more.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, not seeing any. Let's go ahead and call the roll, Love.
Baugh,
Yes.
Bordalazo,
Yes.
Hauk,
Yes.
Larcel,
Yes.
Quinones,
Yes.
Smith, Spivak,
Yes.
St. Martin,
Yes.
Schultz.
Yes. That unanimously passes. Thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Best of luck moving forward. Next item on the agenda is the residential infill project revised proposed draft. So work session, hopefully recommendation. I would like to read a disclosure statement for this. While it's not clear whether the proposed changes create a potential conflict of interest for PSC members because the changes affect such a broad class of property owners in single-family zones, in the interest of transparency, we have the following declarations. Commissioners Smith, Baugh, Backrack, and Quinones do not own properties in single-family zones in Portland. All other PSC commissioners own between 1 and 3 properties that are in single-family zones. Are there any other disclosures that need to be made at this time? Not seeing any. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Sandra Wood. I'm with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I'm here today with Morgan Tracy. He is the project manager for the residential infill project, and with Tyler Bump, our senior economic planner for this project. And we are here to have hopefully our last work session and vote. It's a big day for us and for the commission also for this project. If you're following along at home, which I saw that many people were, the materials that we are going over today are available on our website, and we are live streaming on YouTube also. As with most of our work sessions with the commission and what you discussed earlier, very early in your deliberations back in May of last year, the commission came around and discussed what was going to be kind of the focal point of this project and what were the main goals that you were trying to achieve with this project. And this slide, we've shown it every time to talk about the main goals, which have been equitable benefits and costs. as a result of these proposals. More housing options for Portlanders and less expensive housing options rose to the top. So I just wanted to remind you of that again today. As I mentioned, it's a big day, but we do have a bit more rolling up our sleeves and work to do. And what we have on the agenda today is to talk about the infrastructure analysis that we received from the various service bureaus, the potential amendments that the commissioners have, letters to City Council, and then we can finally take a vote at the end. We know some commissioners have questions about our growth and our models, so we wanted to take a moment to talk about those because it's important for you to understand generally what was before you in previous meetings, but also in relation to the infrastructure analysis, it's important to understand what our growth models show because those play into how infrastructure is analyzed by the different bureaus. So we'll start with that, and then we can go into the service bureaus and then the amendments for the votes, if that sounds okay with everyone. So let me start just by saying for infrastructure planning in general, what we do is we need to run a model on where we expect growth to occur in Portland. This is called, and we've developed it in-house, and it's called the Buildable Lands Inventory. And it's basically our standard practice for allocating growth. Our Buildable Lands Inventory is calibrated. We calibrated our modeling assumptions to the recent regional growth allocations and what the regional growth forecast is. So for this reasons, when we went through the comp plan, we established that as a model, and that was part of the growth scenarios discussion, and it was used as part of the comp plan and as the basis for the comp plan, and acknowledged by the state of Oregon and by Metro, and is calibrated and coordinated with all of our regional partners. It's what we use for the comp plan scenarios, it's what we use for the mixed use zones, it's what we use for Central City, and it's also what we used for our displacement risk analysis for the residential infill project. What happens is that we do the model allocation, and then we give those allocations, the outputs to the infrastructure bureaus, and then they use that for their analysis too, to analyze if their infrastructure can support or not support the growth and where it's expected. So that's kind of the larger lay of the land. Tyler's going to talk to you more specifically about the BLI and the assumptions that went into it and how that compares to the economic feasibility study that we presented to you in December. And then after that, Morgan can talk to you about what the infrastructure bureaus have, what they found through their analysis.
Thank you, Tyler Bump, Senior Economic Planner, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Before we get into the details, I want to state something that Sandra just mentioned, and that's that the BLI, the Buildable Lands Inventory, is designed to estimate how development regulations can impact the geographic distribution of growth. And so when we do these things for different projects, we look at them on a project basis, and then that's sort of cumulative rolling over time. So what we're looking at now includes the comp plan, includes Central City, includes mixed-use zones. In the future, when we do this work, it'll include residential infill, it'll include other projects. So it's this sort of cumulative thing that builds on our existing regulations and new regulations to paint the best picture for us, or likelihood of where development is likely to occur and what the infrastructure issues or needs might be around those areas. The two major points that are outputs of the Buildable Lands Inventory are what we call capacity and allocation. The zoned capacity that we look at is essentially the total potential for development across the city. This is a totally unconstrained number. It's every lot that could redevelop to its highest use is the zone capacity across the city. The allocation that we work with is the 123,000 household units on the residential side of 25-year growth through 2035. So when we talk about allocation, we are talking about that 123,000 unit forecast that we get from Metro and that we use for all of our planning projects. The two things that the BLI does, well, there's a lot that goes into it in the inputs, but the big inputs here are development trends and market factors. So where has development happened before as a big indicator of where development is likely to occur in the future. Development constraints, things like brownfields, things like E-zones, things like transportation constraints. We look at all those things in terms of capacity and constraints, and then come up with the allocation model. So the household allocation, this is for the residential infill project specifically. Our proposed changes create a shift in both the number and type of units in the R2.5, R5, and R7 zones. So before residential infill, we were looking at a total of 16,000 or so units through 2035 in the single dwelling zones. And after modeling residential infill through the BLI and our 123,000 unit forecast, we're looking at 20,000 units in the R2.5, R5, and R7 zones across the city. One thing that I do want to highlight here is that the housing units between these are not the same, is that in the 16,000, we're looking at 16,000 sort of large single-family detached structures as we know them now. And then in the 20,000 in the proposal, we're looking at 20,000 units within a single house, a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex. So the number is a little bit bigger, but overall, the units are different between those two numbers. The other thing that could happen is proposed changes also shift where units will occur. So that's both shifting within the R2.5, R5, R7 zones, and also shifting from other zones in some situations too. So ultimately, what we see as the result on the map that we've looked at before is two things happening. One is shifting where development was likely to happen in the single dwelling zones before, and also shifting additional units from other base zones into these new 1, 2, 3, and 4 unit development types. So that's a sort of baseline of what we're looking at here.
Sorry, are there any questions about what, this is a good point to clear up now if we could. So.
Yep, Chris, go ahead, and then I see Katie's.
So if you go back to that prior slide. So in the baseline, 16,000 large single-family units, many of those were probably already single-family dwelling units, right? So the incremental number of dwelling units is far less than that 16,000. Am I correct about that?
We look at vacant and underutilized parcels. So some of it, a large portion of that is vacant sites, honestly. There's a lot of larger 10,000 square foot sites that have a house on 5,000 square feet of it. So we do count that vacant portion. So it's a mix of vacant and redevelopment.
But then with the second line proposal, 20,000, that is presumably fewer lots being used. So the incremental number of housing units is greater. So if we sort of looked at those two lines and said, new housing, added housing units, right now it only looks like there's a differential of 4,000 there, but in fact, if you factor in what's being replaced, probably the delta is much greater than 4,000. Am I correct in believing that?
It could be. We'd have to look at it to see, but yeah. The thing I think that you're alluding to is that you're getting more out of more units in situations of redevelopment under the proposal than we are under the baseline scenario.
Right. Thank you.
Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, I woke up this morning and read an article in the Oregonian, and it was claiming actually that there was more than one set of data that was used for the studies that, I based a lot of my opinion on whether the RIP was a good idea or not. So I just want to hear your take on that. I want to be able to come away from this discussion with a really clear understanding of what went into that article and what happened on your side.
Sure. So we're going to go a little bit into the comparison of the buildable lands inventory and the Johnson economics feasibility and the comparison between those right now.
I really want to be able to follow this too. I really want to be able to go, okay, now I understand what happened with the Oregonian. So I'm hoping that you don't go so far afield that I get lost.
Okay.
And everyone else gets lost.
Okay.
Okay.
To that, be just real quick before you move forward. Were there any other questions on the information before we move on? Go ahead, Andre.
So, are you going to go into the geographic change that the baseline versus the baseline BLI versus RIP? in terms of the geographic change of the growth?
We're going to, yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so this slide here, which is, I think, the slide that helps probably understand the difference between the two models. That's what this slide is designed to do. The next slide is a map about the geographic changes that we talked about during the displacement risk analysis, but was part of the thing that fed into that. So yeah. And then we get into infrastructure. So these are the two slides that we have prepped to have this conversation.
And then there's also this map that the Oregonian had, and it is a pretty powerful map.
Right,
So
which is
I'd really like an explanation of this map.
Yeah, so let's talk about that when we get to this map. But this slide shows the comparison of the two models, and that's what we were hoping to do with this slide, if that makes sense.
I think it'll be helpful for us to start here and sort of work up to that comparison point, and then if there's any questions at that point, we can sort of go through them individually. With this slide here, there's a comparison between our residential infill BLI forecast and the Johnson economics model. The lighter blue color is the residential infill. I'll start with that one. The way that we work up to the new units.
Sorry, just clarification. The lighter blue is the BLI forecast.
The BLI forecast.
Right, and all three comparisons, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So the lighter blue, we start off with the baseline. How many are we anticipating under the current situation? The middle two bars right there are how many are we anticipating in the addition of the proposals? What's the impact of the proposals? And on the far right column is the total new units over by 2035. So in the blue area, we're looking at 16,000 baseline units in the comp plan baseline, with an addition of almost 4,000 through residential infill proposals, for a total of 20,000 overall units in R2.5, R5, and R7 zones by 2035.
Before we go on, does that make sense? So everything we've
You're
been
adding
talking.
together the light blue. It's called light or dark blue.
That's right. It's cumulative from the left to the right.
Right.
Yes.
And the light blue, all the information we've been giving about what we do with infrastructure bureaus is based on that buildable lands inventory, which is the state sanctioned model, which is the light blue numbers here.
So
we'll get to that in a second. Yeah.
So the blue is the Johnson economics analysis.
Can we say light or dark
The
blue?
light blue.
The lighter dark blue is the Johnson economics model, and this is the second version of what Jerry had done. He had done a couple rounds of analysis as the Planning Commission had sort of tweaked some of those things, and we had internal conversations. So the dark blue ones, there's 3 points that I want to make before we get into here of why they're different. One is that the biggest reason, or one of the main reasons that we had gone under contract with Johnson Economics to look at this stuff, is to make sure that the development types that we're talking about and proposing are feasible within the market. So sort of baseline, why we had worked with Jerry to do that work was to make sure that they were feasible. Two, what he's really looking at is how many people might choose to take advantage of the proposals from a real estate perspective. And that's outside of our total 123,000 unit forecast. His total is total unconstrained demand. It's possible to build these. There's an unlimited amount of folks out there that would want to live in these type of units. So they're not within the constrained 123,000 forecast that we're working with. And I guess the reason that we're working with 123,000, that's our regional forecast. That's what we're required to plan for. That's how we need to look at our infrastructure needs. So they're a little bit apples and oranges in terms of direct comparison, but I do think that they provide a good range of what potential outcomes could be, and I'll talk about that in a little bit here. So Johnson Economics model started with a baseline of about 12,000 units. This sort of unlimited demand real estate feasibility model looked at a potential of about 24,000 new units for a total of 36,000 potential over the 20-year period of time. And that difference in the last two columns there is really ultimately the difference between the buildable lands inventory model and the Johnson Economics model. And that's where if there were a significant increase in demand or unlimited demand, we could get up to that point. The long-term forecast that we're working with keeps us at this lower 20,000 number. And so that's an overview of the differences before we move on.
So Eli and then Chris. Sorry, Chris.
Okay. So, dumbed down interpretation of the Johnson, because I remember when we saw that report, it looked to me like the model is you're just going to see 1 for 1 replacements, and in some area it flips a switch and suddenly you just see 3 or 4 units in the situation, and that would tend to give us a large number of new units, whereas in practice we know from historic experience and the market that only a certain percentage of the homes actually utilize the additional development capacity, because a lot of people don't want to be landlords, and that would be explanation of why in practice you would see not as high utilization rate as in theory the economists would show. Is that consistent with what you're showing us here?
Absolutely, yes.
Chris?
So which of those models is the displacement risk analysis based on?
The displacement risk analysis is based on the 20,000 unit number, consistent with the way we look at our infrastructure.
The light blue one.
The light
for
blue
the
one.
buildable lands
The
inventory.
BLI, yes, that's right.
Okay,
And that's what the state would require us to do. They don't acknowledge the other one.
Right, but so Jerry's looking at an unconstrained model, right? So if Portland becomes more competitive in the housing market because of RIP, because there will be units that have good access to transit lines versus stuff at the edge that wouldn't have very good access to transit. In fact, the displacement risk could be greater.
It's hard to say specifically what the outcomes would be because, again, we're working within our 123,000 unit forecast. So if we were to see more, 36,000 total units by 2035, the way the BLI works is we would have to take those from other base zones and other locations, which has its own set of impacts. So it's not happening in isolation. So it could be possible. It's hard to say for sure without doing the analysis to see.
Okay, so just in terms of how we've been telling the story to ourselves and to the community, we all got very excited about that 24,000 number in the middle column, right? So I think we lost the understanding of the two models and why the numbers would be very different. So I don't know if you can help us sort of recover our understanding.
Well, can I try? We got very excited about the 24,000 unit number because it was evidence that this idea of being able to do infill housing of this type was actually had a economic viability. Like if we created this zoning tool, somebody could actually use it. It would not just be one that was hypothetical and never went anywhere. That was a threshold sort of question that we felt the need to answer, and that's what that's what that economic work did. Now, how much of that gets built over a period of time depends on the growth and of the city, the demand for housing, and the households that are moving here. Does that make sense? If a part of our affordable housing or our housing cost issue is that we have not been a place where the market's been tricked so excessively that it's wildly overbuilt housing, and so we always have a tight sort of supply to our demand. So only the amount, or roughly the amount, of housing that you can actually rent or sell is going to get built, and that applies to this our RIP housing as well. The number that we use for our estimate, for our planning estimate of how much growth and how many households that is this is the buildable lands inventory approach forecast. That's what we used when we allocated 30,000 units to the central city. Remember, in the central city, we have millions of square feet that could be built, but the market's only going to put 30,000 in there in the next 20 years based on our forecast. And the BLI application to RIP is kind of similar. When we looked at the economics of how many properties might actually be viable if somebody wanted to try to do this, you get a big number. When you look at if you were doing that and considering your ability to rent or lease that, like what the market's going to demand, that's a much smaller number. But part of what we're doing with residential infill, remember, is building in an option to use more of our land more efficiently in the long run. We have increased housing and met our our need for housing growth if we just did centers and corridors, but that's not good enough given how much of our land it leaves relatively underdeveloped. It's just a single family. We want more options, more options for housing on those units, and more housing in more places. What we found is it'll work. The pace of change for this next 20 years is relatively modest. The overall net benefit or the overall impact is there's fewer demos and we're still getting more units out of it. And then the last question is the one we're going to get to next is, when you do that, still, is most of this new development impact hitting more, it's landing more in some parts of town than others, and what do we make of that from an equity point of view? So that's how those pieces come together. And so that last piece is the next one we're going to discuss once the screen comes back.
Andre?
So just this issue of the Johnson economics versus this, the 123,000 is a fixed number. So if you push 36,000 or you push from that 20 to 36, you're saying that comes out of another zone.
That's right.
And so the net impact is if you do push into the 36 number, the bluer number, other zones don't have capacity. So less apartments, less condos, less something in the other mixed zones, either downtown or in our corridors. Correct?
Well, it would be this way, Andre. The place that doesn't have capacity is our single dwelling zones. What it will do is leave unused capacity still out there for the future in centers and corridors and shift more into units that you couldn't build before, which are duplexes and triplexes in single dwelling zones. So what it does is it takes some of those units that might be in a new apartment building, might be a studio, the reviled studio that we heard about when we're overbuilding studios is what I meant by that, and shifts it into a unit that's a duplex, triplex, 4-flat, smaller, but still larger than the apartment building in a single family kind of single dwelling setting. See what I'm saying? It's creating an option that doesn't exist today.
No, but it's taking away another option because if I understand it, you're not going to build both. You're going to either build in the corridors or downtown, or if you shift here and you push this becomes a really good option toward the Johnson.
You're not going to build both now, maybe.
Yeah.
But this is, in the future, more housing can be provided on all of our land when the market's here to support the development of it.
I'm just, if the pie shifts, the pie doesn't get bigger. It just shifts around the slices.
In the light blue. In the light blue.
So if the pie, if you push above 20,000 and you say there's a certain number of total units, the pie doesn't get bigger. The darker blue, if you go above 20,000, the slices of pie in a apartment or condo, either downtown or in the corridors, basically doesn't grow. Correct?
They become less competitive than these units.
Yes.
Right.
And so now you have, I think this is back to Chris's question, is that, I mean, I don't know, we're speculating here, but we're also looking out 20 years.
Okay. No, I think what you're seeing is accurate. It comes from one that moves to the other, but it's capped by how much we expect to grow over the next 20 years. But that potential, just like in the central city, when we never thought we would see as much housing as we have now, is still sitting out there untapped in centers and quarters on 82nd, as we just looked at. And now we've added some more potential in our single dwelling zones as well, for not just more housing, but a different kind.
I know, I appreciate it.
So there's a whole bunch of hands that were up on this side. I believe I saw Mike's hand up first. You're good? Okay, then Daisy's hand I saw, and then Katie.
Okay. the numbers we've seen on the potential possible projected cost of new construction under a residential infill project, like what it would cost to buy one of those duplexes or whatever, that was based on the Johnson economic study, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to think if what we see in the light blue is more realistic, right? If we're more likely to get 20,000 units over 36 units. I'm just trying to think, and maybe you can help me think through this. Would that have a substantial impact on the cost of that new housing?
As long as the type is similar to what we looked at before, the cost is going to be similar to what Jerry had looked at in his analysis. It's just the total amount of that type. And so those types are still different, and the prices and the costs of those are still consistent across them. We're just seeing less in the light blue columns because we're constrained by this 20-year forecast, this overall demand over 20 years.
So the light bulb hasn't gone on over my head yet. So I'm still struggling with understanding the difference between these two data sets. So let me just tell you what I'm thinking, and then you can add on to it. So the light blue is it's a number that has been forecasted for a long time, and it's in our plans, so we have to use it. And it's in the law, so we have to use it, etc. And then what then is the Johnson number? How is that? Why is it larger and quite different? And then, a little bit about why you use Johnson sometimes and the other one other times.
I think just to pick up on that last part of the question, there's a little bit of a timing issue here too. We got the results from the Johnson report back in December when we briefed the commission. So that was sort of the first set of numbers we shared.
No, it would really help me if you would tell me why they're so different, because my brain is struggling with that, and then I can take in the whys. And I am not going to hold us up forever on this, but if I get this, then I can move forward.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think it's important to think of the BLI, the Buildable Lands Inventory, in context of our coordinated planning efforts for the region, right? So we have a forecasted population growth that's provided by Metro to all the various cities in Metro. And that helps us to coordinate all of our planning efforts. So we're not trying to outcompete other cities for all the growth. It's part of their coordination construct, and it's also consistent with the growth that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So it's not sort of a number picked out of the air. It's heavily informed by a lot of population studies. So that's a good framework for us to be thinking about what's a feasible or reasonable expectation for what we're going to see in realization of new units over our 20-year planning period. So that's one sort of test. The Johnson report is really it's an economic feasibility kind of model. And if you contrast the first Johnson report with the second report, the first report said, we're going to see a marginal number of new units over the 20-year period of something like 1,700.
Okay.
And one way to read that for the planning staff was that's pretty on the edge of whether this is a feasible product or not. We did see evidence that it suppressed demolitions and some evidence that it created more units, but not a lot, which is a little bit of a warning sign that we might have not hit the feasibility mark. So really kind of when we're talking about the excitement level of 24,000, it says, okay, we know that this product will work. We've got the appropriate FARs that'll utilize these units, or these units can be realized. But they're sort of telling us different indications about the way growth is going to occur. And I guess I would sort of use an analogy of, when you're going for a CAT scan or an X-ray, they're both different tests. They both tell you different things about the same sort of issue that you want to study. In this case, the Johnson report is telling us about the market potential, and that's 36,000 lots out there meet the criteria of being at a certain price point that when you put a fourplex on it, it is feasible to build and sell those units. The BLI model is saying, yeah, that may be so, but really with the type of demand and the housing diversity that we expect over the 20-year period, it's really going to be something closer to 20,000. And the other units are going to be realized in these other zones.
So I don't know if this will help or not, Katie, but I see it as like an economic trend or forecast that's grounded in, and I'm going to go quote unquote reality.
BLI.
The grounded by the BLI. It's grounded by constraints that we've identified that have kind of put together our whole buildable lands inventory.
Okay, and then the other one is unconstrained?
Correct.
I mean, wouldn't it have to have some constraints?
It's a market constraint. So they're looking at the general land values across the city and where those land values hit a certain what we call a strike price threshold.
So economics, like it doesn't make sense economically to build a certain product because there's no profit potential, right? So you have the economic constraint, which is one, that then is kind of overlaid with the actual kind of constraints that are on the ground in our city, which is the buildable land inventory.
Okay. It's starting to go on. It's a little dim, but
I think Eli was hoping to jump in. I've seen Mike, and then I hear you, Teresa.
I'll share the metaphor. I'm a contractor, so I mean, I think of it as like you got a bucket of capacity, and in the single dwelling zones, the Johnson Economic Report says there's economic capacity for this many homes in these zones. There's another bucket of capacity in the multi-dwelling zones, in the mixed-use zones, in the central city zone. Each one has a bucket of like how many homes could be built there economically feasibly. But then you're like filling up the buckets with the chips or with the sprinkler system, whatever it is. There's not that many people coming to town. So they will sprinkle themselves among those different areas of town, different zones. And with the BLI, the Building Lands Inventory, is saying that given 123,000 people coming, some of them will be in the single dwelling zones, and based on the Johnson Economic Report, those zones could actually hold more people than that. But some of those people will go in the mixed-use zone, some will go into Central City. All those other zones also have some capacity for housing home units. So you end up getting like an economic capacity to house people in all those different zones. And the BLI sort of shows how they distribute among them. So none of them get filled up. And this is sort of giving an idea of what the economic capacity is in this particular zone and how much of it gets filled up. And you can do the exact same graph for the central city, how many capacity you could put there and how much actually gets filled up. Same for the multi-dwelling zones, mixed-use zones. Each one of them has, I'm guessing, surplus capacity. And the thing that's hard to predict is when people actually show up, how do they distribute, right? And that has a little bit to do with the cost and what their choices are for housing type.
So I think Teresa wanted to add, or actually Mike, and then I think I had Teresa.
Hope this is helpful. I assume part of the delta on the right between light and dark blue with the buildable lands inventory is there. Johnson didn't really care whether a site might be in the floodplain or on steep slopes and hazard areas, correct? Did he incorporate that? Because by definition, the buildable lands inventory did.
There was a small element to that, Mike. It was so when we had a Z overlay, the proposed Z overlay, that was an input in the Johnson model as well. So some sites were just discounted entirely because we're not allowing fourplexes there.
Right.
But yeah, it's just
Go ahead, Teresa.
Does it make sense yet?
I still kind of wonder why they're quite so different. Were the numbers put into a different model? A completely different model?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Right.
I think another
Because if they were just the same model, it seems like they would be mimicking each other, and
two
they're not
different
mimicking
models,
each other.
and what goes into the model are assumptions, and what comes out are these numbers. So the difference between what we put into it and what comes out of it. And the assumptions for each of the model are different. And the main one that you were hitting on is that in the light blue model, the BLI, there's an assumption of there's only 123,000 households moving to Portland in the next 20 years.
Katie,
But that wouldn't be the different model. That would just be different inputs. Is it a different model? Do you use a different model?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Different model and different inputs.
Yeah.
For a different purpose, too.
Correct.
but they work together as tools, but they're not the same thing. Right.
So I think Teresa had.
Well, I just want to clarify. So the Johnson model, the 36,000, is a financial feasibility of doing it. It doesn't mean everybody's going to do it, or that they even want to, but that's kind of the top number of people who, if they could figure out the capital and wanted to have rental units in their backyard, could possibly do it. And then the other one is how many people are going to show up to take those units. And certainly, if only 20,000 people are showing up, I hope 36,000 people don't go and build something, because there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to have financial difficulty because there will be no one to rent those units. But so they're solving for different things.
That's great. The other, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but the way I guess I've been thinking about it is what you're seeing is a trend. So if you're looking at the baseline versus the middle graph, right, you're seeing a trend in the potential for units to get built from RIP. So it's not, I guess I'm not getting hung up on personally the 24,000 units. To me, what you're seeing is a big difference, which is telling you there's momentum to make that it's going to happen. And then if you're looking at if you come to the far right, and we're looking at now the light blue at the 20,000 versus the unrealized market potential. To me, that actually kind of starts to strike the balance between a modest change. And we've been hearing a lot of concern about neighborhoods and what's this going to look like. And so what this is telling me is we are going to see some of this happening, but we're going to see it modestly happen, which is going to allow us to kind of study this as it goes on throughout time. So it's not going to be like 24,000 units right away, right? It's gonna be a slow thing. And well, it's not even 24,000 units by 2035, right? So it's going to be a slower change, which I think is a good thing for our neighborhoods. I mean, as much as I'd love to see more units now, I think as far as being able to have the neighbors in our community kind of feel comfortable with this change, that's a positive, if that makes some sense. Chris, it sounded like you wanted to maybe jump in.
Yeah, so we have a saying in my business, which is software development: all estimates are wrong, right? Doesn't mean they're not useful planning tools. So the difference between 3883 and 24333, either one tells us we're moving in the right direction, right? So that's not upsetting me. But I also recognize the limits of the BLI. That 123,000 is not a real number, right? That's a number that a bunch of planners got together in a room at Metro and decided on, with hopefully informed by some good data. But that's a number that's decided on, and then you use a constraint. And I served at MPAC. I know how that works. I also know that Portland has historically overperformed its part of the allocation, right? That's not necessarily a constraint. So we're not competing. It's not like a duplex in Brentwood Darlington is competing with a apartment complex on Division. It's also competing with Orenco Station and Bethany and other places in the region, right? So it's not unreasonable to me that RIP could make Portland more competitive in the overall regional market, and therefore the numbers could go up above 123,000. And from a point of view of providing more units, that's great. But it also seems to me that comes with the potential of increasing the displacement risk. So, if the displacement risk is based on a cap of 123,000, that worries me, because I know that cap is just a number we all agreed on, and doesn't reflect the dynamics of the market and the forces that cause displacement. So I guess I'm looking for some way to comprehend. I think, Tyler, I asked you the question after one of the meetings, what are the error bars on the displacement risk? And it's pretty fuzzy, right? So I'm hoping to get a little reassurance around that range of possibilities on displacement.
I just wanted to add to that. So the 123,000, you're right, is some planners in a room and an MCHAC deciding on this and talking about it. But we are on target for it. So our allocation models are from 2010. We're 8 years into that, and I believe Tyler and Tom have come to this very body showing what growth has looked like every year, and we're right on target for that growth. Does it provide such a big difference that we're gonna all of a sudden,
Blow the model out?
yeah, blow the model out? We don't know. We also don't know how IH is really going to be playing out either, because that occurred, and you hear anecdotal things, but it's too soon to tell.
In terms of the displacement risk, I think what we had talked about also is that the discrete numbers are really hard to say that's going to be 20,031 housing units in 20 years. Back to the trends, is this moving us in the direction that you want to see? In the displacement risk analysis, we know that those areas that we have concerns about, we're going to have concerns about regardless. And so what do we do about it? And so in terms of the trend, I think it's helpful in decision making. It's also something that we're going to need to track over time. And like we do with other projects, we track inclusionary units, we track different development types across all different parts of Portland, we track central city development. Like, we're going to continue to track this, and to the point where that we see an issue, we're going to raise it and say, where there's an issue, we're over exceeding or we're under building what we thought we would build. So that sort of ongoing tracking is something that is part of our work plan. It's what we do.
Any other questions? Katie, has a light bulb on?
Yeah, let's move on to the map then. Yeah, and the geographic distribution of these units.
So I want to find out how realistic this is. Is this using the Johnson numbers then?
No, that's the same numbers. So the data at the tract level is the same. The only thing that's different are the categories that you see in the legend. So we have the categories on the left-hand side over here, -106 to -40 on the screen, -39 to -50, 51 to 90. The only difference between those two maps is the scale. The data behind them is the exact same. The reason that we use this scale here is because it's a best practice in how to classify and categorize data when you've got a wide range of data points. So we're going from -106 to +421. And so in order to best show trends across these, this is the sort of GIS approach to do that. The map that you're referencing just has a different scale, and the breakpoints for those categories were made for a different reason. And so that's really the main difference, but the data is the same.
Any other questions?
So, essentially, when I look at the 4,000 that are net increase between the baseline and then when you look at RIP, really the increases in those are coming in the areas that are yellow, orange, and red, or
correct.
That's where the increases are coming. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we heard from the previous presentation that area has about 39% minorities, somewhere in there. I'm just trying to point out that the increase is coming in areas where there's high populations of minorities, which we've seen on the other maps. Is that correct?
Yeah, this map also shows the displacement risk areas, so that's kind of helpful in terms of context.
But it's coming in East Portland where there's high populations of minorities. Yes?
Yeah. I think another sort of fact to highlight is when we're looking at this delta change, it is specific to the 3 RIP zones, the R25, R5, R7. And there are, as we just discussed, the changes in the pie are reducing units in other areas that are could be multi-dwelling, could be R10, R20, RF. So when you look at East Portland sort of overall in the unit allocation, it's not quite a 2,000 net increase. That's just showing the units that are going to R25, R5, and R7.
Now, I'm with Katie now.
Right. But this, what another way to say, I think, is that what this is looking at and the numbers that we're showing is a subset of all growth that's happening in the city.
Yep.
Right. Lots of growth in Central City, lots in centers and corridors, some in other residential zones. So these numbers are only for our 2.5, R5, and R7 zones, not any of the other zones.
And so we're only talking about RIP. I understand that.
Correct.
And the impact of RIP and where that occurs. So that's not occurring inside of Portland, I'd say in the inner neighborhoods. It's occurring, the growth is really is growing outside. Not relative to race, just more units are occurring on the outer part of Portland versus the inner side. If you say out of 4,000, the 3, whatever the number is, there's more units being produced on the outer part of Portland than in inner Portland. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's correct. And that makes sense, right? Because those lot houses are probably smaller, less expensive. The land values aren't to a point where it doesn't make sense to tear down or redevelop into a fourplex.
But you can still get the rents that would support doing that. So that's why it's this sort of inner ring. It's where those rents are accomplishable as well. And even in all the analysis that we've done, it's sort of pointed to that market, or that sort of economic sweet spot. But when you look at this map that staff has up right now, right, the areas that are hatched are displacement risk areas. And remember, our displacement risk criteria include communities of color, renters, educational attainment, and income. So it's almost yes. Where you're seeing, and this, we talked about this last time. That's why we called out the 3 impacted areas, especially Lentz and Brentwood, Darlington, in terms of the need to focus on specific strategies for those. It's affecting areas with large populations or more populations of community of color, but it's affecting it in both ways too. If you see the areas of town where, but for RIP, you might see more redevelopment and displacement. Those areas are relatively neutral or improved. That's the hard part of this. Is overall, remember, we saw that it didn't have a differential impact on community of color, but the places where the market's in the right spot to really pick up on this type of development are showing up in those yellow and red areas. And roughly that corresponds to the map that was in the Oregonian too. I mean, that's not hiding any ball.
Any additional questions? I'm not seeing anything, so let's move on.
Okay.
Is that, yeah,
So
we're
now
okay? Okay.
Now that we're all firmly grounded in the BLI, and the light bulbs have all gone on. So this is, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about our infrastructure analysis and sort of the top level findings, but if there's questions, for sure ask. For the transportation, there were small and localized impacts that affect some roads of concern. So when we're talking about roadways of concern, it's ODOT and PBOT facilities that are already at, projected to be at or above capacity by the end of the planning period. So roads like Powell and Lombard. But the impacts were small and rather insignificant. There was about somewhere between 10 and 27 additional trips in the PM peak hour for these roads. In some of the other areas that were not roadways of concern, I think the maximum number topped out at something like 50 additional trips in the PM peak hour. So we have an obligation to address those impacts under the transportation planning rule. And so looking at some of our existing opportunities, there are capital projects that are already programmed in the transportation system plan. As these projects are actually designed and built, one way to address the impact is to accommodate the additional trip generations into those designs. So just sort of accounting for that additional growth as we build those projects out. Small scale multimodal investments, these are things like pedestrian and bike improvements. Small scale means things that are under about $500,000. Along with a number of transportation demand management TDM strategies, including eliminating minimum parking requirements, which is part of our proposal in RIP, thanks to the Commission. Expanding area parking permit programs is another topic for further discussion. Along with existing programs like the Smart Trip Education and Outreach, and this is really a program for new residents that move here to get them up to speed about our alternative modes of transportation and great ways to get around the city without using your car. Safe routes to schools includes a little bit of that outreach education, as well as some infrastructure investments in terms of improving safety crossings. And then looking outside of just the RIP zones, looking at updating the bicycle parking code, which this commission just looked at recently, is useful. That will apply mostly to multi-dwelling and mixed-use zones, and expanding existing transportation demand management incentives, such as bus pass payments for residents in larger residential buildings.
Any questions about that?
Are these funded?
The Smart Trip Education Outreach is, Safe Routes to Schools is funded, updates, expanding incentives. Yeah, the things that are, the capital projects are part of a constrained
Constrained budget.
Constrained budget.
Mhm.
So they're already planned for.
Yeah.
They're not funded.
They're not necessarily.
But they're in the
I know
comp
that.
plan as the future, future growth of 123,000. How are we going to accommodate this growth? And these other
I
projects.
know the drill,
to
but they're
build,
not
yeah.
funded. And
And
so
fiscally constrained.
They're in the
the
fiscally
constrained
list.
and they would be hopefully funded as a mitigation strategy. Do you have an idea whether they would be moved up because of RIP if it passes, or do they stay in the out years?
Did we talk?
No.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely not proposing any comp plan amendments to the project list, adding new projects or reprioritizing projects. So Bob Kellett from PBOT is here, and he's been helping us, and he's been doing the analysis for PBOT.
Right. Yeah. So that's an excellent question. They probably would not be shifted. These are already areas that we have identified through the comp plan. As we know, we need to address these. We have, as part of that adoption of the comp plan and the TSP, we agreed with ODOT that we would be looking at these specific projects. And so a lot of them are on ODOT facilities, which, complicates matters in terms of how you get them in the pipeline. But they are priority areas for us.
In other words, they were already priority areas, and so you can't make them more of a priority. Something like that.
Well, I'm just talking about the timeline.
Right.
I get there in the constrained out years, but RIP is happening today, and so I'm trying to see if the transportation improvements are going to happen today or
right. And
down the road,
and when we look
or
at the
correspond with the RIP.
Yeah, when we look at the transportation impacts, we're looking over that 20-year horizon.
Yeah.
So, there are needs today on some of these roads, and there'll be needs 20 years from now. And so, when we're programming our projects, we're looking at that horizon of the 20 years.
Okay. And the transit components, are those programmed also? Because those are TriMet.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's built into the transportation model. I'm sure all of you want to hear more about modeling after your previous discussion, and transportation modeling is another animal into itself. But yeah, that's built into our transportation model. So all of the future TriMet service that we'll be seeing over the next 20 years is in there.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. It's a little easier for sewer and stormwater. So the sewer system, unlikely significant effect based on the additional fixtures that are being added to the system. For stormwater, it really hinges around the building coverage regulations that we have in the proposal, and we're not planning to change those from current limits. BES did want to highlight that there are some areas that are currently challenging. So areas in Southwest are more hilly areas where they have trouble with stormwater disposal. But they are in the process of developing a stormwater management systems plan, which will help inform future stormwater management manual requirements. So there are existing issues with our existing limitations on building coverage. Because this project isn't increasing that, there's no impact, no additional impact for stormwater, although we could add that we are decreasing the amount of square footage that can get built on a site, so that could have a sort of a roundabout way of decreasing the net building coverage that is built. So.
Can I just add, I think not requiring parking is also a plus for the stormwater management too, because if you're not putting in impervious surface and asphalt or concrete on your lot, then that's less impervious surface to manage.
Yep. For the water system, it's even brighter. They size their system for fire suppression, so actually a lot of water capacity for serving that need. So when we're talking about incremental units being added throughout the city and different places, it really does nothing to their overall system. They did highlight the fact that there may be some areas, and I think we talked about this previously, is there may be existing water mains that are insufficiently sized to serve a particular development, and when that happens, the developer is going to be required to upgrade those water lines to meet that service need.
Do you know, do they have an idea of where, this is mostly for sewer and water, but where those improvements would need to occur? I understand the southwest, but any other areas of Portland?
For water or for
water?
For water, it's we have a map of their bigger concern is around the substandard water main sizes, so the 2-inch lines, and we do know where those are, but it's not every situation is going to require upgrading to occur. It depends on how much of how many fixtures you're adding, how big your water meter needs to be to serve that development. So it's a very case-by-case sort of determination.
I just want to tie it to, it appears the growth is going to occur in East Portland. So is East Portland more impacted than the rest of Portland, I guess, from that water issue?
It won't be impacted from the standpoint of you would need to make the improvement to make the development happen, right? It's a condition of your development.
But the development would have to incur that cost,
yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Oh, yep,
just
Mike,
a quick
sorry.
one. Yeah, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, Parks was declared an infrastructure bureau, which is appropriate. Did you have any conversations with Parks in terms of capacity and meeting future park needs?
Yeah, we had Parks represented on our technical group, and we were looking at capacity issues. There's 2 parks, I think, that are identified as concerns with capacity over the longer planning period, and they're in South Waterfront is one area, and I think the other area was downtown. So they were not in our single dwelling zoned areas. There's obviously a need for additional parkland for East Portland, for instance, and then we have a service standard of accommodating a certain percentage of our households within a quarter mile of a park, which this actually gets us closer to. So Parks Bureau didn't respond with any issues. Okay, on to the amendments. So we have 2 sets of amendments. One is a list of more substantive amendments, the actual changes in the proposal, and then a list of about 9 technical amendments. And I'll leave it to Chair Schultz to see how we want to handle these, but we can go through them one at a time, or we can group them, whatever works best.
Commissioner Smith has something he'd like to propose.
The officers have discussed a little bit how to speed this along and make sure we can focus on the things that we really want to talk about. So we haven't polled the commission in advance, which we often do. So if anyone objects, I'll certainly withdraw this. But I would move that we adopt the technical amendments and substantive amendments 4 through 8 in one consent motion, if no one objects. So that would leave us.
Should we
1
clarify
through 3
that
to
the
talk
4
about.
through 8 are the ones the staff supports?
Yeah, those are all that have staff support.
Thank you.
So.
Okay. Any discussion? Nope. Okay. I assume we need to do a little vote on that, right?
That would be
Thank you
important,
for
I think.
teaching me my
Oh, yeah.
Robert's rules. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We should call the
we
roll, I
should
think.
vote.
Yeah, we should call the roll.
Okay. I've been called out. Let's do a roll, love.
Ball,
No.
Bortolazzo,
Yes.
Hauk,
Yes.
Larcel, Quinones,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Spivak, St. Martin, Schultz.
Yes. So that passes with one opposed.
Okay. All right. So we have 3 substantive amendments to discuss. This first is introduced by Commissioner Baugh to restrict housing options in some areas of the city. Essentially, proposing 3 ADUs in lieu of allowing for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes in areas that are noted here as displacement risk areas and within the Southwest Corridor. And I'll leave it to Chair Baugh to explain further.
So I want to start by just a little bit of the questions that I asked. This is really about, when you look at RIP, it's about residents between 30 to 80%. In terms of, if you make $60,000, RIP does not help you in terms of the baseline. The issue, we talked about the BLI and the 4,000, but if you look at the Washington Post, National Home Builders Association believes that this middle income is really, and their economists, not me, but their economists is saying this is really the sweet spot now for home builders in the future. This middle income housing, it is the right price. There's a market demand for it, and when you look at so you get to the amendment, and really what I'm looking at is holistically for the city to say, in the areas where we are going to have the largest impact, and that's basically in the areas up there, except for downtown Portland does not have residential zoning, but the other areas, let's slow it down at least. Let's the duplex, triplex, and fourplex is the engine that drives RIP. Let's pull that out. Give us some time to get, call it mitigation, but at least get a strategy together to give people between 30 and 80% an opportunity in the single family dwellings in the city in that area. What's the strategy to keep the people there? Because the development is coming. Whether it's coming fast or slow, we won't know. And by the time, if you look at this map, it's 4 years old. There are neighborhoods that are already grayed out today if you updated that map. It is turning over. Let's pull back a little bit. Let's have an opportunity to put a strategy together. RIP is going in today. There's no mitigation out there. When you listen to the Housing Bureau about their mitigation and what programs they have really nothing for home ownership, very little for home renters. And the programs they do have are oversubscribed. And if you've been around Portland as long as I have in the housing, working with the Housing Bureau, starting back with PCRI 20 years ago, you know, the efforts are checkered based on our leadership. And so, and the leaders of that Housing Bureau. So they've done great jobs at times, and at times they've done poor jobs, and council has acknowledged that. We need to have a strategy for the area that's going to be impacted around with the most diverse population. We need a strategy. We're going into this without a strategy of how to help the people that own the homes, that rent those homes. This is single family dwellings, and it is the dream of most people in America to own a home and have that home. And we're going to take, you know, almost 25% of the population and say, we can't help you. we're just going to move ahead and let's keep. I mean, I'm not supportive of RIP in a holistic way, but I get it. We want to move forward. We want to do this. And so let's slow down in some areas. It really is 5 years. And after 5 years, if we can't figure it out, everything disappears. As these gray out and they transition, the areas transition out, they get the full mill deal of RIP. And if council down the road says we're good with the strategy we put in, it gives them an opportunity to pull RIP and then put it in place in a full-time measure. It will alter the displacement risk, and that's the point. That is absolutely the point, because it takes, in my view, it takes risk off the place that has the most development, and it takes the development risk out of there. Restricting units to ADUs, yeah, it slows it down. That's the point. That's what I'm trying to do, is slow down RIP in areas that have high risk of displacement. Lastly, it's another overlay. That's the business we're in. We're in planning. I have been doing this for 10 and a half years, and overlays have been argued. Yes, we ought to do overlays, and no, we don't. That's a great argument, and I love staff for saying they don't want to do overlays, but I remember when we were overlay kings and queens, and we put a lot of overlays on. So I don't know if that's right or wrong today, and maybe that's bad policy from the comp plan or other policies we placed through, but it is an opportunity, I think, for us as a city, and a city that believes in inclusiveness and diversity and equity and the 11 policies of housing that we have in the comp plan, to say we do care about these residents really in this slot, and how do we help them try to do something. We don't have the tools. I don't know what the tools are, but how do we help pause for a little bit and help them? And from that standpoint, just give them a little bit of time and give us time as a city to put things in place if we want to. If we don't want to, we can move ahead. The city today has said they're focused on 0 to 30 residents in terms of their household. And so when you say 80%, that's people that you just finished your taxes, you're at, $60,000 or somewhere in that neighborhood. And we're saying we're not going to help you stay in your neighborhoods, buy a home in your neighborhoods. And we're not building homes through RIP to be affordable for single families. And that's problematic. So that's what I'm trying to get you to join me in. But I get it.
So, do you want to have discussion or put a motion on the table?
I would like to put a motion on the table to restrict the housing options in some areas.
Second.
Okay, discussion. So, just because I started looking this way, Eli, and then I think I saw Ben's hand. That's it for the moment.
Well, the part of this I agree with is that we should reevaluate, because there's a lot of changes in this code update, and we'll have to tweak it. But we've been slow walking RIP for 5 years now. I've got the notes from our first meeting. It was September 15, 2015. Morgan was here, Joe was here. And in those 5 years, there's been huge amounts of displacement in the city with a lot of new homes. We've seen what happens when we don't actually change the rules of the game. And RIP, a lot of these areas on the map are areas that under RIP, you get less displacement than we get today. I mean, RIP is a tool to help reduce displacement because it provides more housing options in the neighborhoods. And to throw it out because it doesn't serve households that are like 30, 50% is not a reason to chuck it out. It helps provide less expensive housing options in every neighborhood. PCRI supports this project. I mean, they gave us testimony. because they're largely priced out of these areas that they've worked in the past. And I agree, homeownership's a dream for many people. I mean, I worked at Habitat for Humanity when I came to Portland, and if you look in the yellow parts of our city, the single dwelling zones, people are already priced out, and it's getting worse under current zoning. So I don't think, I mean, I think that this amendment it's subtle. I mean, it's retaining in some of the elements of RIP, which I appreciate, like the ability to have more units and get a little more square footage or floor area. But I think that delaying it and adding complication to it perpetuates the current status quo, which is that in order to buy a house, you have to be able to afford to buy a piece of land with it and your own single-family detached home. And if that's the only choice out there, that leaves a lot of people out of the market. So if you already own a house, or are lucky enough to own a house, or to come to Portland from a more expensive other city and you can buy one, then you're in pretty good shape under current zoning. But that leaves out a lot of people, and including people living in these neighborhoods. So I guess I'm concerned that on this overlay area, many of these neighborhoods, we could go back to the other graph we had up earlier, are areas that are helped by RIP. RIP is definitely not a silver bullet, but it decreases the displacement pressure in most of these neighborhoods, and including those that are the city's identified as high displacement risk. Not every one of them. That's correct. So I think it adds complexity. It's going to push things out longer, and I think RIP can be actually an effective tool to help make homeownership more available to folks who are otherwise priced out. Although it will not get down to people at 30, 50% without public subsidy. The amount of public subsidy needed per unit, though, does decrease when home prices go down. Thanks.
Ben?
A question to staff in regards to the applicability of this proposal specific to the Southwest Corridor, understanding that it will be, or hopefully will be, a high capacity corridor. Zoning doesn't quite reflect that, but it will, supposedly in the future. How effective, how much realistically are we really looking at as far as single family zoning along a high capacity corridor?
Well, I'm actually going to defer to Commissioner Baugh on this. We had a little bit of discussion about this geography.
So, and I apologize, I did not address the high capacity corridor. The Southwest is a recognition that we as a commission have said the Southwest corridor will have displacement, even though it doesn't show up on a map, and that we want the city, and we told the city to make a substantial investment, hundreds of millions of dollars, into try to mitigate that. The definition of Southwest corridor, and I struggled with Tracy to try to figure out what is the definition, because you don't want to just say it's the project area. And your question is a good one. I'm not really sure, but what I do know is we have said that there is a displacement risk there, and how that's defined, I'm not sure. I'm not wedded to Southwest. I mean, if it passes without Southwest, I'm okay with that, because I think we do have at least a good plan for the corridor, the light rail corridor. But I'm trying to think, we've recognized the problem, and we're not, even though it doesn't show up in our analysis, we should at least recognize that in some manner if we're thinking about RIP, was just a thought.
Does that answer your question, Ben?
More or less, yeah.
Teresa, go ahead.
So I just want to speak a little bit to the value of time under Commissioner Baugh's amendment proposal. When we think about these areas, and there's home ownership, and the low-income homeowners are going to need some time to figure out, one, how to find the capital, and two, how to gain the development skills and the expertise to actually implement RIP. So in my mind, giving a little bit of time to see how it plays out on the ground in some other places, and to put in some programs to do some education, would actually be really helpful in preventing home ownership loss, and perhaps, increasing the number of units that are there. For example, you have a house, you can barely maintain it. thinking about being a landlord is huge, right? There's things coming from state legislation, city legislation. It's kind of frightening. I've never done it before. I'm going to take all my nest egg and I'm going to build this other thing. And I'm going to rent it. And how is that going to work? So, I think that time to educate the community and let them have the ability to take advantage of the opportunities rather than being taken advantage of because there is opportunity by somebody who's willing and ready to go.
Looks like Daisy, you're leaning in. Okay.
I think one of the concerns for me is, of course, the areas in RIP that are likely to see the most displacement are around 82nd. And we haven't talked about the compounding effects of the 82nd Avenue project, the compounding displacement effects of the 82nd Avenue project along with RIP, right? If 82nd Avenue is likely to displace a lot of minority, POC, immigrant business owners, and then we're likely to also see displacement of low-income renters in that area. That's really concerning for me, and I wish we had more information, and it would be interesting to see maybe like a displacement risk analyses of both of those two things combined. I know we're crunched on time, but I just want to put that out there. And I also want to remind us that Portland Housing Bureau and Joint Office of Homelessness have been doing a really awesome job. They have a lot of great services, but I want to remind us that even with all that they're doing, there's still a huge amount of need among the poorest people in our community in terms of housing.
Katie?
Yes, I also wanted to, I think I support this because I feel as if that first, especially a 5-year moratorium, would send a really strong message to City Council that we kind of mean business about this, that we're not anti-growth, that we're not putting a moratorium on these areas forever, but we're saying these kinds of programs need to be in place, and as you've seen, there's like this, a lot of the forecasts we've seen are of a 20-year period. So that first 5 years, is not, we're not going to be killing, RIP, Eli. It would be actually just saying, we really want City Council to do something about this. I was on the, I was a budget advisor for the city of Portland for a number of years, and I was on there when $6 million was allocated for inner Northeast to mitigate against the displacement that unfortunately had already happened. And I was like looking at the $6 million and going, this isn't going to go very far. But now is the time in East Portland when maybe $6 million would go very far. And I don't know where they got that $6 million, but it just popped up and they gave it to inner Northeast, which is not that I think they've got money hidden away somewhere that they can just pull out and devote for things like this. But it does mean that if there is enough of us saying you really need to do this, then there's more likelihood that it will happen.
Chris, go ahead.
I'd like to poke at the form of development suggested here a little bit. So I assume the emphasis on ADUs is because that means the main structure is less likely to get torn down and therefore there'll be less displacement. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, if you go back to the genesis of really where this started way back when, it was about demolitions and size of homes. So it was trying to, in talks with Tracy, trying to preserve the idea of the size of the home, some of the structural characteristics of RIP in terms of size of home and what you had to build as part of that.
Okay. So I think staff has already pointed out that 3 ADUs are unlikely. If possible anywhere? Is that
It's
can we
more
imagine?
challenging, right?
Yeah.
It's challenging on a number of fronts.
So we're likely going to reduce the number of units from that point of view. And I think probably more important to me, ADU is limited to 800 square feet. So we're not going to see family-sized units. We're basically going to contribute more to the studio-sized set of units out there. So I think we're not addressing some of the housing need that we wanted to get at. And as this is worded, I don't think it's not talking specifically about detached ADUs, right? We could have internal ADUs under this amendment. Is that correct?
So based on other conversations we had around what happens when you get 3 units into a single structure, the building code kicks us into a triplex. So I think the most likely scenario from a form standpoint is a house with an internal ADU and 2 detached ADUs and somehow in the back.
But the development of that internal ADU could have a similar displacing effect, right? If you're tearing up the house to carve out an internal ADU, you're probably going to boot out the tenants while you do that, right?
Yeah, if it's
Not
currently occupied
necessarily.
by renters.
I would say not necessarily. I mean, it may, but like for instance, if it's in the basement, you could still continue to live in it.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, I'm sympathetic to the intent of this, but I'm inclined to agree with Eli, and I was particularly struck by folks who were concerned about displacement, who actually asked us to increase the area that's being covered because there are opportunities that are afforded people as well. So that's my thinking on it.
So I have kind of 3 different thoughts going through my mind. One is, especially in the areas where the map with the current proposal is showing lower displacement, and knowing that being able to put RIP throughout more places kind of lowers rents throughout kind of broader areas of the city, I'm troubled a little bit by the thought that it seems what we're doing is it's an inequitable proposal to take an area and just say you're at a risk of displacement, yet here we are with a proposal that's lowering the displacement, yet we're going to take that away. So that doesn't seem like an equitable option. Does that make sense? If RIP today as proposed is lowering displacement, and then we're putting this overlay that now perhaps increases it back to the way it is baseline today, that does not seem equitable to kind of single that little neighborhood out. With the question of time, I guess I certainly have respect for the concern there about getting options for education and opportunities perhaps for equity in place for a broader variety of people. But I'm also concerned that if you take these areas out of it, what is going to happen is there are going to be some redevelopment. It's going to be redevelopment into big, larger, single-family homes, which now creates even broader disparity in these neighborhoods, and certainly more displacement because you're not creating more units or options for choice there. And I can't even read my writing anymore. And I guess it also is striking to me that we're expanding it into areas, I guess it's kind of piggybacking on that last point, into areas that are of lower income, yet we're leaving the option of redevelopment to units that are more expensive for one family unit. So that just seems to create more disparity and more inequity, and therefore I'm having a hard time supporting this amendment.
Can I respond to that a little bit?
Sure.
I'm likely to vote against this, but I think I don't agree with some of your criticisms of the amendment. I want to make sure we have an open and honest debate here. So the building size limits are still in effect in all parts of the city under this. Is that correct? So you can't get the McMansions. We're not allowing that. We're just
okay, good point.
Dictating the form of development, so you can't do a duplex or triplex, but you can do several ADUs. So I think that the displacement lowering aspects of RIP are still retained here, and it's, if I think I understand Andrew's intent, it's accelerating that because it doesn't allow the duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes. So you're again, trying not to tear down that that existing main dwelling to minimize the displacement, but you're not. But I think the size limits, which are one of the main displacement breaks, are still there. So I'm not.
No, point taken, and thank you for clarifying that. And actually, I remember now what my third point really was, which was having multiple ADUs or multiple detached units is a more expensive building option. So you actually are increasing construction costs, which means you're increasing the rents for those potential units than if you had done triplexes or fourplexes. So that was really what I meant as my third point, which just means to me you're creating more disparity.
I'll address Captain and Eli, but I think there is, when you talk about the units that will be displaced, I think staff is making the point for me. There's going to be very few ADUs produced just because they're difficult to do and they are more expensive. You're not going to get the tear downs because the size of the unit is restricted just like everything else in the city under this. So the real opportunity to me is we're not going to have a significant amount of change in these areas that are at risk for a short period, very short period of time, 5 years or less, to put something in place. And then when you release it, you still have capacity because you've not filled up that capacity that is in RIP with ADUs. To my view, and what staff is kind of proving here, is that capacity is still there. You can then develop to that fuller capacity. And so I just see it as all we're doing is delaying that redevelopment to a later stage, and that when that occurs, we've got tools in place that do address that. To Eli, I struggle with this idea of greater good for the people above 80%, and the 30 to 50 they're going to lose anyway, and they just don't count. I think we are a city of one. We are a city that is of diversity, of people, and we have to take into account everybody. We can't just say they don't count. The starfish is going to not survive, so we're walking on. No, pick the starfish up, try to save it, because if you don't save that one, if we say certain people don't count, we can't help them, who's next? I mean, who's the growth for? And we really have to think about 100% of our residents and 100% of the people. And yes, there's more people moving in, but if they're moving in from a higher income into this neighborhood, as the Washington Post points out, that's the market that home builders want to come and build for, because that's institutional. They can build for them, and they can use RIP. And in Denver, where the Washington Post looked at this, that's what they were doing. So it's just delaying this process for a little bit of time. I get it. Everybody wants to move ahead fast, but you hear from the infrastructure bureaus, you hear from a lot of bureaus, we got to get things in place, and nothing's in place. And RIP is going to go into whenever council says yes.
Daisy caught my attention first, then Eli, then it looked like Chris was.
One of the things, so I support this amendment. One of the things I'd like to add, and this is anecdotal, but from my experience growing up in East Portland and working there up until recently, the ADU option could also be really attractive because there are a lot of multi-generational families. There's a lot of multi-generational living. So I think just because we don't have the data on that doesn't mean we should discard this as an option that wouldn't work well enough. To Andre's point, I think when we talk about middle housing, it's kind of like a trickle-down housing effect. And I just want to acknowledge that just like trickle-down economics doesn't work and doesn't benefit the people at the bottom, trickle-down housing doesn't either. Or if it does, it takes decades. And I would really and I support this because I think it provides more of an opportunity for folks who have been under-resourced for a long time.
Go ahead, Eli.
Well, I guess I'll respond to that point first, because I've heard many times the trickle-down economics, trickle-down housing comparison. The reason some neighborhoods enclosed in Southeast are still have affordable homes is because they were built 100 years ago. The housing is not so nice anymore. Some of the homes during World War II were internally converted to multiple units, much like WIP would allow. And that's some of the legacy of affordable housing we have in those neighborhoods. So housing does become less fancy over time and becomes more affordable. And thank goodness we have those examples from the past when you were allowed to do a range of housing types, because that's where our legacy of market rate affordable housing is in the city right now. It's in Northwest Portland, it's in close and east neighborhoods where housing was built a long time ago and is relatively affordable now, even in fantastic locations. The concern I have is, and this is I pull out the comp plan map sometime, is, I mean, single family zoning is not some panacea. It was deliberately invented to exclude certain people from neighborhoods, particularly people who are low income and not white. And it has expanded over almost our entire city. Our comp plan right now, yellow here, I brought props, I like props, sorry, is single family zone. It's almost everywhere. And what's getting built in those areas are large single family homes, right? That's your housing choice. So the thing that's challenging for me, and I appreciate this amendment allows multiple plexes. It's a fairly subtle twist on what's RIP proposed. But we've really diminished our housing choices so that in most of the city, the vast majority of our yellow area of the city, is we're building houses for the people coming from outside the city, you know, who can afford to buy in at the high end of the market. We're not building housing for people who've been here a long time and will maybe never be able to afford to buy their own 50 by 100 foot lot with their own single family detached home on it. I want to provide options for folks like that who already live here, and that's the only way they're going to live in one of these yellow areas of the city, which is most of the city. Traditional single family zoning is not a good thing for low income folks, and it never has been, because it's unfortunately it's sort of an exclusive situation. It works very well if you already own a home in those areas, and I think that the RIP, one of the things RIP does really nicely is it manages for scale, so we have the scale right in those neighborhoods, and it increases housing choice in those neighborhoods. And we're really missing the housing choice piece here. And I think that this amendment would scatter some versions of housing choice. I mean, it would be a different level of choice. Like you could do 1, 2, or 3 ADUs. That would be the housing choice you'd have in those areas. Other parts of the cities, you could do duplex, triplex. They're still capped out at the same size. I mean, I get that it's not that different in the choice thing. Implementation-wise, I think it would be kind of a mess because you'd have to like figure out where you are, whether you're building 2 ADUs or a duplex with an ADU. Like the rules being subtly different in different parts of the city would be difficult to implement. But I think it's mostly about housing choice. And our city was built out before zoning with a range of housing choice, and we got a range of housing types. We got single family homes, mostly single family homes, even where someone could have built a 10-plex. We got a single family house. We're not opening the doors nearly that far, but at least it would get rid of the ban on apartments, small plexes in what's become almost the entire city, the single family areas. And I think that this amendment would not devastate the proposal, but it would add an implementation wrinkle that would be very confusing, and it might extend a project that's been going on for a long time, during which we've seen massive amounts of displacement and really big houses coming up every month. They're still coming up now.
So, just an implementation question. This goes into effect. Let's say it passes by some miracle. And I just want to explore Eli's point. So the implementation is by what is the mess? I guess I'm trying to figure out that is here that that we're developers are going to have to go through.
So there are a couple.
I mean, is it extraordinary out of anything else they would probably have to do? I guess that's the issue.
Well, I think one of the more significant challenges is the notion of having 3 ADUs allowed for this period of time and then not allowing it. So there's this sort of you can create non-conforming situations. So how did the third ADU get on this lot and it's not allowed there anymore? So how do you refinance that property if it's a non-conforming development? And then sort of the shift, like we talked about the need for educating property owners about their ability to utilize these provisions. We're now talking about 2 different schools of thought. Yeah.
Right. For now, for 5 years, you can do this, but after 5 years, you'll be able to do that. So there's that aspect of it. I think one of the things that Eli was.
Go ahead. The ADU, you can grandfather that in today in the code. If you modified this a little bit, you could say if you built the 3 ADUs, you're grandfathered in. You could.
Right. If you built the ADUs prior to 2023,
you could grandfather them.
They're still allowed.
Okay.
I think what Eli was mentioning was that as a builder, you would have to be very cognizant of which census tract you were in to know what product type you would be able to build. So if you were successful in building a triplex over here, you go 2 blocks over and you wouldn't be able to build a triplex over there. So then you're like, well, I have this 3 unit thing. Can I just do a duplex with ADU? And we would say, no, we don't have that product type. That's called a triplex. And they were like, well, it's the same thing. It's 800 square feet. Why don't you call it an ADU? Yada, yada.
My neighbor across the street did it. Why can't I?
Yes.
I'm just thinking about a general homeowner.
Right.
I have one question. When was this? Remind us when the displacement, what year the displacement or areas at risk of displacement were identified on this map?
The map was updated more recently in 2016.
2016. Do you think there's certain properties today that are highlighted that are out of the displacement risk because they've
so there was
we had
census tracts? You mean, like some census tracts would not
are there
be?
some areas that are now brown that should be gray because they've
There's potential for ups and downs here because it's not just it's reflecting 4 different types of vulnerable communities and aggregated, right? So that's our displacement score. So over the course of 5 years, we could see more displacement risk areas pop up and some existing displacement risk areas drop away as those communities are either the relative proportion drops.
Change. Yeah. So I guess the point, kind of, or maybe back to Andre, is how help me think about that. In that, this may be this is likely inaccurate as it is, and how do we kind of plan for that or deal with that?
My view is it's fixed going forward. It's fixed in the areas today, and if they disappear, and I don't know when they're going to show up or when you're going to update this map or when it would be updated. But if in the 5 years it's updated and areas disappeared, they're just off. We're not going to, I'm not looking to add, I'm just.
So how is it fair for an area that maybe wasn't identified today that becomes an at-risk area 2 years from now, and they're going through the exact same challenges that any of these other areas are today because they were in an area that RIP was allowed, but now they're at risk of displacement 2 years from now because they haven't been identified, but yet that community is just as at risk of displacement as the ones you've identified perhaps on this map today.
You have the same risk as you would have in the normal RIP, because even though you update, if this doesn't pass, you're going to have that same change in the neighborhoods under RIP, and there is no provision under the normal RIP today to even try to help them. At least there would be tools hopefully in place that those residents could use, even though they're not on the map in an updated map relative to without this, there's no indication or no push to council to say, let's create some tools.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Chris was trying to jump in.
So could I invite Tyler up while I pontificate a little bit? So I want to think about the 30 to 80 and the 80 and above. So clearly the benefit to the 80 and above is creating more housing choice here. We knew that going in. That, in fact, I'm glad we got the 80. I was worried it was going to be 100 and above. The benefit of RIP to the 30 to 80 is that the size limits are limiting displacement risk to some degree. So there is a benefit in base RIP for the 30 to 80 population. We're taking some of the pressure off. Andre's amendment would take probably a lot more of the pressure off for that first 5 years. So I can see the benefit there. I just want to understand the consequence on the other side. So Tyler, applying the Jerry Johnson kind of view to this, if we take, all these mapped areas off the table for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, I assume that will push more of the market to the gray areas rather than the brown areas. And since land values are higher there, the duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes we do get will have higher rents than we would have seen on average citywide with the whole map. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, I think that's one potential outcome. It's hard to think about these. I'm hesitant to say yes with certainty because
I think we all learned today there is no certainty.
Yeah, well, part of it is we just don't know until we look at it in detail and see what the changes and what the total and unit likelihood in these different areas are, and what that means to. It's running a huge new scenario to answer that question with certainty. But I think in general, your statement is true that if there were demand that still existed, those units could be built, but they can only be built where they're feasible, and where they're feasible could be more expensive.
Right. So, I think I agree with Eli that this is not crippling to RIP. It complicates things. It does shift that equity equation a little bit, and I think I'm still with the advocates that we heard, including the anti-displacement folks who were really arguing for the housing opportunity as one of the key values, and not trying to do geographic answers to displacement, but instead look for the programmatic solutions. And I know we still got to push City Council to do that. So just want to understand all the pros and cons here. Thanks.
I think Ben had his hand up next, then Teresa.
I think this amendment has great intent. Tend to agree with what Chris just said. I think at the end of the day, it will take out some opportunity. What I'm struggling the most with, though, is the apparent inconsistent approach of singling out a specific area as the Southwest Corridor and introducing that special treatment for this area and not other areas. And are we getting where are we getting ourselves into? I'd like to get your perspective on this. Why specifically on this Southwest Corridor, not other areas that are perhaps even more at risk?
Again, I'm not wedded to Southwest Corridor. I looked at Southwest Corridor because it had been identified by us as a high-risk area for displacement because of a transportation project, and we had encouraged council through that Southwest Corridor plan to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to mitigate that. And it seemed as a compounding issue, RIP brought single-family dwellings to that area, and even though it's not in this corridor, in this map of an area of displacement, it has been identified as displacement. So I was just kind of logically saying, if you've already identified it, why would you not do something in that area? But I mean, if it's an issue of we need to take it out to get your vote, I'm good with that. To the other question, that is, I would say to push council. I've been here a long time. What pushes councils, 5-6 council, at least 5 mayors and a bunch of council members, is things that make them change their mind. I've probably signed a lot of letters that say we need you to do this, that, and the other thing. I haven't gone through and said how many of those things have they really done. And so asking for mitigation it's just another piece of paper on the pile. When we have taken action as a commission to say, we want to do this, and council's had to make a decision to change, then the thoughtful process comes. Maybe they do the additional analysis, and I understand that there's not the analysis here to say what is the true impact, as Tyler talked about, but maybe they do demand that, and they see the impact, and people see that, and maybe it's not there, but all indications it is. And council's probably not going to take that action unless they're put in the position to do that. And this is an opportunity to make council think about this more deliberately and RIP.
So just looking at the time, and I want to make sure that we gave Andre's amendment here because it's pretty complex, a lot of time, but I'm going to let Joe jump in here a little bit. And then I guess I would ask if you've got questions of Andre, then I'd like to let those go ahead. If you've got more comments that would be more appropriate to come along with your vote, then I'd ask you to hold for the moment you vote on this amendment. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt the vote because I think we should probably go there. I felt, though, obliged to just say that I understand the intent of what Andres described, especially in the argument he just made about even influencing city council. So if we're voting for that intent, I would understand that. But this amendment is not going to accomplish that intent, is my fear, because in that the amendment that would accomplish that intent is just not to do RIP in these areas. See, I think that we're kidding ourselves a little bit by coming up with the size changes, adding ADUs. ADUs is really just a unit. So I don't want us to think that this particular mechanism is getting that intent, because my best professional judgment is it's not. And the other thing to remember is, on the map that we looked at, some of the areas that are shown here in blue, or in brown, the other blue, actually benefited from RIP. So it goes back to Kat was getting at one aspect of this, where this map and these areas change, so it's always going to be a little out of date, but that's okay if we're just being conservative to protect something, which is what I heard Andre arguing. But we're talking about a move that I don't think is necessarily going to accomplish the end, as valuable as that end might be. And our analysis already told you that it's taking out areas that would have benefited with less displacement due to single-family house piece of this only. So I think that I just wanted to be clear that voting for the principle is one thing, voting for this as an approach to get it, I would not... I can't really see how that works.
Okay, so are there additional kind of questions for Andre or staff on the amendment itself? Not seeing anything, so I think let's go ahead.
Can I offer just a little piece of information too? I think when we think of East, we've been talking about 50 by 100 lots for so long. In East, these generally aren't 50 by 100 lots. They might be 70 by 120 foot lots. So the comment that Kat had made about the only opportunities to build one house, even with the FAR limits, if you are at R5, you're at 4,200 square foot house on a lot it is that big. So they could be larger houses, smaller than today, but larger houses than the ones that we have been talking about.
Okay.
Aren't we keeping the same total size?
We are, but those
By
lots
far.
are larger, and so they're
Larger,
based on
yeah.
Florida area ratio, which means that the size of the structure can be larger. And I'm just pointing that out because I think when we're thinking about affordability, and really what this amendment would do is to say you're restricted and build one house. It could be up to 4,200 if you buy the 70 by 120 foot lot, which there are many of. Instead of building 4 units at 1,000 square feet each, or even actually larger because they get more FAR, and offering opportunity to more households.
But they could do the reverse and build 3 ADUs because you have more square footage, correct?
Well, they cap out at 800 square feet.
Well, they cap out.
Right.
Yeah, but it's easier to do the 3 because you have more square footage of land.
Yes, because you have more space.
Okay. So we've been kind of doing straw polls, but I have a feeling some people might want to add something in. Or maybe it's just, does anybody need to add anything with their straw poll vote except Teresa?
This is not a straw poll, it's an amendment.
Oh, it's an amendment. You're right. Thank you. Yeah. So no, we'll call the roll and you can add your comment at that time. Thank you.
So
It was, did anybody want to amend anything? I mean, I'm open to amendment.
Well, I wouldn't mind amending to take out Southwest Corridor because I just feel like it's not really, yeah, it just doesn't seem like it fits in with the other areas. And would anyone
So accept
second that?
Friendly amendment?
Friendly amendment, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll accept that.
Okay.
Ben?
Oh.
The Ben amendment.
One more heads up for the commission on this amendment. Since we have not prepared the specific language or done the mapping or additional analysis, then basically this would be giving staff direction to keep working.
Correct. Thank you for the clarification for everybody. Okay. So, Love, please call the roll.
Yes.
Bortolazzo.
No.
Hauk.
No.
Larcel.
Yes.
Quinones.
Yes.
Smith.
So I hope that every city council member is made to listen to the debate we just had, but no.
Spivak. St. Martin.
So I just want to say a couple things. It's an inconvenient problem that we have with displacement, and so there's maybe going to be some inconvenient solutions, but I really feel like we need to give it our best and actually try to see what we can do there. And I know we'll improve, but in the spirit of that, I'm going to vote yes.
Schultz.
No. So it was very close, but does not pass.
Okay.
Amendment number 2.
In a little more mundane conversation, perhaps. So
We started with the meaty one on purpose.
the second amendment here is currently we've got existing language in our books that says if you're doing a duplex or attached houses on corner lots, that the units have to match each other in terms of trim and siding and roof pitch and roof heights. And one of the elements that has to match is windows on all facades. And so the amendment introduced here is to apply the window matching requirement to just the street-facing facade of the structure. Give it to Eli to
I guess step away from 30,000 feet and get looking at a project. My intent for this was just to make review easier. I think if you're building a attached homes facing two different streets, what matters is what you see from the street versus the window orientation on the other side of the structures. So I think anyone building two new homes is going to make the windows match, because it's easier to do that than to make them mismatch. And I thought this was just a way of saying that you just have to match what you see from the street. You don't have to match the other facades of the building that are facing a back or side yard. So it was, it's not a huge thing, and I thought it would just simplify review times and wouldn't, and builders would do this anyway, whether it's required or not.
So do you want to make a motion?
So I would move this amendment number 2.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Discussion? Questions? Teresa?
So the only thing I would respond to on that is if builders are going to do it anyway, then leaving it in there shouldn't hurt them. And then just for the concern that people have is, I'm going to have this big thing in my backyard and whatever it is. So it's really for more the surrounding neighbors and the issues that we've heard with people being concerned about what they don't know, and just having to look at something that's different than the grass and the trees that were there.
Go ahead, Andre.
My concern is that in standardizing all the windows, you get into a factory house. So all of a sudden, you can tell that house is in, that ADU or it's the duplex or something, and they all start to look the same. And we end up with a whole bunch of homes that look the same. And if they're going to do it, then do it all the same, let them do it. But if they don't do it, then we have some variety, and that variety in a neighborhood is what I thought we valued. That not every home looks just like the other one.
So I'm just going to push back on that, and I think this is it's the key, at least as a designer's mind reading this, is proportion and orientation. And unfortunately, I think your picture is not a very good one to explain this, because they're actually similar proportions. The only difference is that you've got shutters on one versus the other. So think about it as the existing home has a bunch of really long horizontal windows, and the attached house now has a bunch of vertical windows. And so that would be, for example, an orientation example that is mismatched. And I guess where I'm going with this is, to me, this makes sense as far as if you're looking at character of our traditional neighborhoods. We have pretty consistent kind of vocabulary going on with windows, and so I guess I support this, especially with knowing how neighbors are concerned about how their houses look today and what their neighborhoods are like today. Any other comments, questions?
Kat, did I understand you support current code, or you support the amendment?
I don't support this amendment. I support it as it's written.
I would say, Andre, if you want to suggest that we just drop all the requirements on Windows, that would be a friendly amendment. I like things all different out there in the world. This is not a big issue for me. I just, so.
And we're not.
I don't know if we have a second. Do we have a second?
So
yeah, there was a second.
And so the code currently doesn't require that all windows in the neighborhood match. It's
it
on the
requires
structure.
the
I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
Just to make it's one of the design commission talks about a lot about cohesion within building design, and to me this is just a line item that's getting at trying to make the design of the attached house cohesive with the existing house. It's a piece to that.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? I'm not seeing any. Let's go ahead and take the roll.
Ba,
No.
Bordalazo,
Yes.
Hauk, Larcel, Quinones,
No.
Smith,
No.
Spivak,
Yes.
St. Martin,
No.
Schultz.
No. So 7-2. Does not pass.
Alrighty. Last up on our amendments. So this is related to our historically narrow lots conversation. So lots of generally 25 by 100. And in the R5 zone, so we have sort of two sets of these lots. There's our 2.5 zones and R5 zones with these historically narrow lots. In the R25, they were allowed to have 0.7 FAR, or about 1,750 square feet per unit. In the R5 zone, they're capped at 0.5 FAR, or 1,250 square feet per unit. So the amendment here is to allow attached houses on narrow lots in the R5 zone to have a little additional FAR up to 0.6 total for the two units. And I think this is Spivak as well.
Okay. So this is something that Jeff and I wanted to bring up, and he's not able to be here. The dynamic going on here is remember you have the narrow lots, and what does the city would do with those? And the ones that are closer into centers and corridors are being proposed to be rezoned R2.5, which means more scale and massing. And those further afield stick with the R5 massing, the smaller massing. And we realized that there's a wrinkle in there, which is that if you have a 50 by 100 foot lot with, and you just put a duplex there, you can get 3,000 square feet on it, which you could do on any 50 by 100 foot lot, R5 lot. But if you have a historic property line down the middle, and you bring back that line and you try and build a 3,000 square foot attached townhome, you can't do it, because each half of that lot is how you base your FAR on. So you actually end up with 1,250 square feet per side. So the fact that you're bringing back that historic property line actually decreases how much house you can build. lower than you could in any other home in that neighborhood zoned R5. Well, I don't think I did that great a job describing that. But there's this anomaly that on the same lot, if you use the old property line, you can build less for duplex than you could on the lot next door that doesn't have a historic property line. And so this is trying to address, just to make parity between those two situations.
Go ahead, Teresa.
But couldn't you just use the current property line and build the thing like the thing next door?
You could build, you could put a duplex on the site and not bring back the property line, and then you could build 3,000 square foot duplex. That's right. The question is, can you sell them to different people? Some of these people want to own their land too, not just one half of like a condo unit and a 2-unit condo. And this, I guess if this passes, then you can build the same structure as you can build in any R5 lot, and you could sell one half to one person, one half to the other person. They'd have to be attached. But if you wanted to do a duplex, if this thing doesn't pass, then you try and do that, and you're suddenly stuck with smaller home sizes than you could with just a duplex on the site.
To me, what I find interesting about this is it's creating parity for home ownership to have the same size home as you would have if you rented it, because it was a duplex, right?
Yeah.
Ben has a question.
No, just a comment. From a former standpoint, there really is no difference between a duplex and 2 attached homes, so having regulations that reflect that makes sense to me.
Okay. I'm not sure we got a second on the motion.
Okay.
But
I'm not sure I even proposed the motion.
You want to propose it as a motion?
I'll propose this motion. Yes.
Okay. Great.
Just so this is trying to get around, if you built condos, you could get a larger unit, correct?
Yes, you could. Yeah.
You could build a condo and get to 3,000 square feet, but if you built a duplex, you're at 1,250.
Same size, you're smaller.
A duplex can be 3,000 square feet.
If you build 2 attached homes.
Yes.
If you build attached homes, which...
That's a condo unit.
So attached homes, this is the city's like definitional land. Attached homes means they're each on their own lot.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're each on their own lot, you can build smaller. You can only build...
You have to build smaller.
You have to build smaller, yeah.
But if you condoize them...
If you build a duplex and condoize it, then you can go to the full size. So it's a different... how large you can build it. And that difference makes a difference because first-time homebuyers tend to not deal with condos that well. And 1,500 square feet gives you more like a 3-bedroom unit. I think it's very important for these narrow lots to be able to say consistently, you can't build any bigger than you build for a single-family house. And this is consistent with that. And this is more to say that whether you're building it as attached homes or as a duplex, how much you can build is the same thing. Maybe I made it complicated.
So I think in the discussion, just to tie it to the discussion you had with the skinny and historically narrow lots before, there was, I don't know if you remember the map, the yellow and purple map. There's about 14,000 of these lots. And the ones closest to center corridors, you are proposing to rezone those to R2.5. The other ones, what I found compelling, I guess, in your last argument when you talked about is you decided scale matters. By rezoning it to R2.5, you get the 0.7 FAR, you get higher height, and those are the basic differences. And these R5 lots that are further from corridors, they can still confirm the lot line, but the scale matters and the scale needs to stay smaller. And so this move basically moves it a step closer to R2.5, but not quite R2.5. The difference is 250 square foot per lot. In general, the way the zoning code is structured is that all development standards are reviewed on a lot basis. That's why lot lines matter. We measure setbacks from lot lines, building coverage is by lot lines, so calculating FAR is by what's on that lot also. So that's what's in your proposal currently.
So Chris, you had your hand up?
Nah.
Still? No? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Anybody need the light bulb turned on? Because that was really fuzzy. Doesn't Doesn't look like it. So let's go ahead and call the roll.
Ba,
No, I just think we ought to, if you want to condoize it, condoize it.
Bortolazzo,
Yes.
Hauk,
Yes.
Larcel, Quinones,
No.
Smith,
So we really have to deal with this fee simple issue somewhere, sometime. I don't think today is the day. No.
Spivak,
Yes.
St. Martin,
Yes.
Schultz.
Yes, that passes. So we've now gone through all the amendments.
Yeah.
All the other amendments were on consent.
Moving forward.
Great. And I believe we have time to take the vote on the entire package.
Got a couple quick things first.
You want to talk about letters to council before we take a vote, do you?
Yeah, because we wanted to end on the vote.
My concern is this may take a while, but that's okay. Can people stay a little bit later to...
I don't. We weren't envisioning it taking a while. We just wanted to catch the rest of the commission up to what the officers talked about. I think you already saw the letter earlier today about the anti-displacement letter of support. Have you? You already saw that in the items of interest from the director? Great. Which means that normally when the commission makes a vote, there's a transmittal letter to city council, and we are planning on writing that transmittal letter. But as your deliberations have occurred over the past several months, there have been many topics that you have decided or have said, let's include that in a letter, let's include that in a letter. So now we're envisioning 2 letters, and we just wanted to let you know about that. The first letter is your formal transmittal letter to the city council describing what the vote is, what the dissenting votes are, and really your high-level communication to city council. The second letter would be additional topics for council's consideration in their work in the future. The list of topics that we have collected as we've gone along include this list of topics here. And we just wanted to assure the commissioners that we haven't lost those topics, and we know that they were important and you got into the debate around those topics, and we'll capture that. But that's the plan, is to have 2 letters. And that's all we wanted to say about that before the vote.
Are there any questions or concerns about that proposal?
We're going to talk about it during the vote, but I guess putting on the second letter additional displacement mitigation just seems like a disservice in the second letter versus the first letter.
I think we assumed that's probably going to go in the first letter, since that was the biggest topic of discussion. That's a leftover slide. Yep. We'll update it.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Any other comments or questions on that?
Well, as long as staff makes it clear that because a lot of the things we're concerned about are in this other letter, less important letter, that it does not wind up being ignored.
You will all have a chance to
Ignored.
review the letters, and we can do that.
As typical, we would see the letters getting circulated. For what it's worth, there's a lot of topics here. I'm concerned that we're going to have a letter, if we put it all in one, that's really long, and we know how that goes. It doesn't all get read.
It may be bigger than the staff report.
I am confident that I and others who share my concerns will make it abundantly clear to council our concerns.
Perfect. Okay. So
just to that point, how and when will council see this, and what will be, I guess, the presentation strategy? Have you guys just thought about that yet?
We've begun conversations with the mayor's office, because we're under the portfolio of the mayor, and have talked about having a couple work sessions ahead of the hearings for the public. We're planning on having the hearings for the public going with our work sessions in late summer, so that they have a chance to understand the debate that you all had, and understand what the proposal is before they start listening to the public opinion about it.
Okay.
So this may look somewhat familiar from your last hearing item. We have a 2-part motion. So the first set of the motions have to do with directions for staff, and the second part of the motions are recommendations for City Council. Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Oh, just read through them? Yeah, so the first is directing staff to revise Appendix H, the displacement risk analysis, to incorporate staff analysis from our memo that we shared with the commission. So right now there's sort of two pieces of information floating around. We'd like to consolidate those. And then also revise the staff report and code commentary to clarify proposals and findings as necessary. So again, where there are areas where we can help provide greater explanation or more context for some of the proposals, we can have the room to do that. The set of recommendations, or the second set of the motions for the recommendations to City Council, is adopting the residential infill project as revised, as amended rather, amending the zoning map and comprehensive plan map as shown in volume 1. So that's our R25 zone changes and the Z overlay. And amending the zoning code and comprehensive plan is shown in volume 2. So that's basically our code and commentary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, are you going to make a motion for us?
Well, I was going to suggest that since Commissioner Spivak has been at this from the very first day on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, that the honor of making the motion should go to him.
Certainly.
Thank you. What do I say here? Yeah, I mean, I won't use this to say my 2 cents, but I appreciate that all the work staff's put into this over half a decade, and the thousands of comments we got in, and I will move that we adopt RIP and recommend it to City Council as proposed here with the anti-displacement language in the first letter. Thanks.
I think Commissioner St. Martin has been with us from the beginning too, so maybe she wants to second it.
I'll second. Thank you. Any additional discussion on this motion?
I know you had asked for 2 minutes, but it's going to take a little longer than 2 minutes. This is probably my last full commission meeting and disappointing meeting. I want to start with we at the city, through the comp plan, took a look and we knew that East Portland was at risk. There's no surprises there. We had back in 08, 09, the BLI showed that there was going to be a displacement risk. We created, and I say we, the commission created, along with the housing groups, 11 strategies. You know, some of those strategies we thought would never happen, rent control, but we threw it in there. It happened. Displacement is not a surprise and should not be a surprise to anybody here. The surprise to me is that we're unwilling to do anything about it. RIP does not address 30 to 80%. We knew that was the risk going in, the 60 to 80%. So we knew the risk going in, and we're unwilling to take the courage to do something about it. We are a city that has embraced equity in the Portland plan, have gone through, and part of the issue that I had with the letter around this issue of anti-displacement improvement plan is we're going to displace people, and as Eli has said, yeah, there's people being displaced. There is a connection between diversity in a neighborhood and the businesses in those neighborhoods, and as we displaced, they could go to East Portland, but there's nowhere to go. You cannot buy. Who's going to rent to a person that's at 50% of their income? As a business person, you're going to take the best credit risk, and that's 30%. You're not taking someone at 50%. So the people at the 80% that are trying to get into these homes, 60%, 40%, as a minority, as Matt said, they're at 50%. Yeah, the housing unit built, they can afford if they want to spend 50%, but is that unit owner going to take them as a credit risk at 50%? I highly doubt it, because you're in business to make money, and you're not taking high risk, you're taking low risk. I mean, as much as And so this anti-displacement plan seems like a feel-good measure to me, because RIP is displacement, and now the mayor says, or well, not the mayor, but we want the mayor and council to look at implementing an anti-displacement plan. Well, what are you going to do about RIP? If people are leaving, why don't we spend money there? Let's not spend money on this. And so it's kind of an oxymoron to me that you want to spend money on this and not put money into fixing RIP. We are considered one of the whitest cities in Portland, and I think RIP really becomes, as I said before, institutional racism to create the whitest city in Portland. And you know, the 5 years that I proposed was just an opportunity to give us a break, to say, how do we really respond as a city, and recognize the value of people in this economic class. It's not only minorities, but it's low income, it's working people, you know, that are going to serve your coffee tomorrow and your dinner tonight, that you can now say, these are Portland's not for you. And unfortunately, Portland's the wealthiest city, so where they go, there's less services, there's less things, and those cities are faced with greater challenges that they have to go to. And that's the disappointment, that we are not willing to step up to that challenge. I think there is also a fair housing issue here. I think if you dig deep enough into the displacement, I do disparity studies. There is disparity here in the Fair Housing Act, and I think Portland's going to run into that, hopefully. Anything just to slow that. And I'm not against the volume, but volume's sake, at the end of the day, that creates housing 20, 30 years, 40 years down the road that has fallen apart, and that people can fit into in an income level in 80%. Seems like Portland's suggesting we want to get into the slum business. That's how slums are built. We're not in that business. And we need to take pride in holding everybody as citizens and producing products for everybody. So I'm going to vote no. And obviously very disappointed in how what we're sending to council, because council has no urgency, nothing to make any changes to RIP in any shape, way, or form. And I, you know, I will close with, I really do appreciate staff. Staff has done, to me, an amazing job of bringing us information. Tyler, you've done, Tracy, Sarah, it's just an amazing job. And so this is not an indictment or anything. I think you've done and put information in front of us to make a rational decision. So it's not, there's nothing you've done wrong. I think we just are making a bad decision. And I leave it at that.
Are there any other questions or deliberations? If not, well, we haven't voted. Did you actually? We haven't called the roll, right? No. So, kind of intent had been, and not that we can't change it up, that we can take the roll, and with your vote, you're welcome to kind of preamble if you'd like. But yes, I mean, I just was trying to lay the lay of the land, but we're in the middle of deliberations and discussions and questions right now on the motion on the table. So are there any other comments or questions about the motion on the table? Go ahead, Eli.
I guess I'll use the time I have now rather than when I'm actually voting, is my thoughts. I think that the concern about displacement that you've expressed, the target for those barbs should be traditional single-family zoning, and RIP takes measures to open that up for more inclusive neighborhoods. And the good things I see about RIP are that it decreases displacement pressure in most of the city. And I acknowledge the city has limited resources to have this anti-displacement programs. It will allow the city to focus those on the areas where it's happening the worst, which we also saw on our maps. And the real culprit in our city's woes and other cities' woes in terms of displacement, how fast it happens, is because we place our single-family neighborhoods off limits to infill. We need to have those housing choices. We've needed to have them for 75 years, and we banned plexes way back then, which meant that there's nowhere to go. If someone gets displaced from North Portland, they're not just going to a little bit away. They're losing the house because they can't share the land with another house, and all the other neighborhoods, they're already filled up. We don't have any room for homes. We say we have no more room for homes, but we do have room for homes, and we should have inclusive neighborhoods where the problem with single family zoning is that it works for a few people. It works for those who already own homes and who are wealthy enough to move here, and it doesn't work for people who teach our kids, care for loved ones, staff social service agencies, nonprofits, people who are of color who have historically not had the means to buy their own home. They don't work for people who plant our trees, who nurse our loved ones. I mean, those people should be able to live in a neighborhood in Portland, on my street, in any neighborhood. And in order to live on that street, you have to be able to buy or rent your own home on your own piece of land. You ain't welcome. And I think that's the unfortunate fact of single-family zoning. And the residential infill project addresses that head on and provides more choices in those neighborhoods than what's allowed today, where increasingly whole neighborhoods are off limits to all those people I just mentioned. And getting to the nitty-gritty for a second, I mean, RIP does a lot of things separate from that right now our code doesn't even touch. It provides requirements for visitability. It increases housing options in a society where almost 2/3 of households are 1 or 2 people right now. And look what we're building under today's rules for the past 5 years. It provides an affordability housing incentive that doesn't exist today. It protects and supports, urban green trees, because it decreases, it sticks to the building footprint. And actually, if you're doing 2 stories, you have to shrink within that, shrink even less than that. And on the carbon side of things, I mean, carbon should be part of our mission. And we know that the best thing you do for the environment are smaller homes and attached homes. And this encourages smaller homes and attached homes, which under current rules are really, they're hard to build financially feasibly. You almost have to build large homes to afford a lot. So I think that RIP is more of a shift than a big change. I think it's going to be rolled out as a big change, but it basically says you can't build homes as big as you're used to building it, which I think people will support, and it's saying you have more housing choices, which I think people will also support. And it won't go as far as a lot of people want in either of those directions, but that's my reason for thinking it's probably a good thing for an inclusive neighborhoods in Portland going forward.
Any additional questions or comments? I'm not seeing any. So, Love, if you could call the roll.
Ba.
No.
Bortolazzo.
So do I get my 2 minutes now?
Yep, you certainly can.
All right. I'll try to keep it maybe shorter than that since we're past time. Overall, I'd say, while not perfect or hitting all the points, I think this piece of legislation does what it was designed to do. In my mind, one of the bigger goals of this commission is to use land more efficiently, and I think this does that. And I think to do that, we really needed to tackle the land use that has the biggest land mass in the whole city. It's basically almost 50% of the land mass of the city. So I think this does that, creates more housing choices. And another thing that I think was really important to do was to create something that responds to different households that we have now. And and address a need that is somewhere between what's provided by the nodes and corridors and nodes and corridors, and the single family, so the so-called miss the middle. And I think it kind of opens up more opportunities for that type of use. One thing I'd like to say, I would like to thank staff and fellow commissioners for great discussions, but specifically staff for answering and following us, and really go through major change in the code. But I think it was for the better, so thank you. And I vote yes.
Thank you.
Out.
Well, I think we're operating with the best information available to us. I feel comfortable voting yes on this. Having grown up in outer southeast Portland and traveling out there now and looking at, I think we're providing opportunity for people. Speaking for myself, Eli mentioned folks who work for nonprofits. I'm one of those people, and without divulging how poorly some people are paid in the nonprofit sector, frankly, I would not be where I am right now had I not had the opportunity to buy into a fourplex with an appropriate amount of space that I can afford, both in terms of getting into it and paying my property taxes. So I think we are providing opportunity for people by adopting this. Yes.
Marcel?
Well,
your mic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I am going to vote no, and the reason I'm voting no is not because I don't think it's a good measure, but because of the mitigation. And I really don't think that just by having it go to City Council, there will be any pressure on them to do anything about mitigation. There, we'll have a letter, but I would really like to see East Portland be able to come and meet this piece of, I guess you'd call it legislation, come and meet this change and have some resources at its, disposal to be able to take advantage of this so that it helped the people that are homeowners there now, and for the renters and the different groups of people that may struggle under this. And I believe it will pass, but I would like it to pass not unanimously. I would at least like City Council to be able to say, well, why did they vote against it? So I think the more message we can give them that we have concerns about this, big concerns. I do. So I'm voting no.
Quinones?
Hi. This is my first big vote, so I'm a little nervous. First off, I want to say thank you to staff as well and my fellow commissioners. I've only been part of this since September. I share a lot of the same concerns as Commissioner Baugh and Commissioner Larcel. So I'm coming from a place, I think when you are somebody who's experienced displacement yourself, being somebody who has worked with a lot of people who have experienced displacement, there's a sort of intuitive knowledge that is sometimes really hard to articulate about what will cause your displacement, what will cause your community to really transform into something that is no longer for you and is now for people who earn much more money than you, for example. I say this with having this experience of displacement, but also as a planning student. Given the history of planning, thank you to staff for providing us all the information you did. But I also, again, want to reiterate that even though the displacement risk analysis showed that there would be less displacement under RIP than the baseline situation, that is only accounting for RIP. And there are so many compounding things that can lead to displacement. So due to that, and also as Commissioner Larcell was saying, I don't think a strong worded letter to City Council will be enough to get them to really act boldly on anti-displacement under RIP. I'm voting no.
Smith?
So I want to add my thanks to staff. Done a great job. I'll go back to the remarks I made when we started this, that in my mind this is all about equity and the very challenging task of balancing housing opportunity with displacement risk. I am very proud of this commission. I think we've had some very difficult discussions, but I think prouder about the outcome that we've achieved, which is balancing the creation of housing opportunity, which is vitally needed. We can't solve our housing crisis without supply, so supply is an absolute necessity. But at the same time, finding the jujitsu to get the building sizes down to the point where we shape the economic forces so that we are, on the whole, reducing displacement risk. Now, have not achieved doing that everywhere. There are specific neighborhoods where that risk will go up, and that is troublesome. But I think we're not able to address that problem with maps and code. I think those have to have programmatic solutions. And while I recognize the challenges of that, I also want to reflect that clearly we have not solved our displacement problem, but we've made lots of progress in the time I've been on this commission. There have been 2 major bond measures for housing in the time that I've served here. We've introduced inclusionary housing, but we're clearly not done. East Portland remains a big challenge for us. I think we've taken some steps. We need to take more. I'm very supportive of Commissioner Larcell's idea of a district plan or area plan for East Portland. It becomes, I think, now much more of a budgetary question than a code and map kind of question, and we have to keep going there. This commission has a limited scope, so we can't chase that as a body, but as individuals, we're all capable of lobbying and advocating for those necessary changes, and I hope we all will. So I think we have done a very good thing, and if we push too far, we're at risk of making the perfect the enemy of the good. This is a very good thing, and I am happy to vote yes to advance it.
Spivak?
Aye.
St. Martin?
Well, first, I definitely want to thank staff for all the work through this whole process. You've done a really great job. And particularly, I'm very encouraged by the start of our displacement analysis program, and I'll look forward to that. Just the process and the analysis becoming more robust over time as we get more experience and some on-the-ground tracking. I think that's a really important part of what we need to do in the future. RIP addressed the size of homes, and that was a big issue. We have some demolition reduction kind of incentives there. So I think those are some good and successful parts. The one thing I think we can't ignore is the displacement risk. It's a tough problem, and I know that there's no easy solution that's just waiting for us, but I still really have a concern that we don't have targeted and funded programs to help with that, and that we're doing some exacerbation, although there's many other factors as well. I think in particular, picking some areas might have sent a strong signal, and that if the programs existed, they could be available to anybody throughout the city. So I think there was some value in that particular approach, and it's unfortunate we couldn't get there with that. But it is really important to recognize that the diversity of our city makes it a vibrant city. If you think about what's the newest, hottest restaurant to go to, it's an ethnic restaurant, and we want to encourage that. We want to have people be able to be entrepreneurs and to come here and kind of start out. But in terms of displacement, I believe that the most effective method is to prevent the displacement. So taking care of some of those low-income homeowners that we have and helping them to stay and figure out how to sort of create that generational wealth with whether it's capital or just, you know, learning development skills or learning how to be a landlord, that those things take time and that we really, really need to put those in place. So because I would like to send that signal that displacement, we just can't ignore it, I will respectfully vote no.
Schultz?
Is this on? It is. So thank you, everybody, for sharing your thoughts. Staff, definitely, you have done a phenomenal job with an extremely complex, tough, controversial project. You've taken it from one direction to a completely different direction, and you've gone along for this ride, and you've done it, I think, extremely well. So thank you. I want to just kind of quickly address some information I've received from the community since we kind of started talking about the project, and it's with regards to kind of the direction it's gone with this proposal. I would say that we as a body, as a commission, did spend some time listening to listening to the testimony that we received, reading the testimony that we received. And from whatever it's worth, my point of view, I found it very fascinatingly divided, and very much so divided between people who have a home today in our single-family neighborhoods and those who would love to be able to live in those single-family neighborhoods. And I found that striking. And then I also found very important, as you heard our deliberations, with how do we kind of layer in our comp plan goals and when we put our kind of priorities together on the what you reminded us of our goals at the beginning of this work session is how that changed perhaps the direction. Well, it didn't change perhaps, it did change the direction of where this proposal was going. So I just want kind of to acknowledge the community that we did hear you. But it was a combination of listening to the community's concerns as well as also what we're trying to achieve in the comp plan. To each of you, I can't tell you how impressed and how proud I am of the deliberations that we've had. Everyone's been extremely respectful. I think everyone's really seriously listened to the other points of view. And perhaps maybe more poignant to me is the concern that everybody has, which is in common, which is displacement. I don't think there's a person on this commission who isn't deeply troubled and concerned about it. And the fact that we did all the work that we have around it is important work, and I'm glad we did it. What I find very interesting, and I hope, as you're seeing from this vote, is that a lot of us are arriving at perhaps the same intent of trying to do good, to try to acknowledge that, to try to help what's happening in the city, but we're coming to different conclusions on how best to respond to that displacement. Personally, the fact that I think in general and overall we're seeing displacement reduced, rents lowered through this proposal, I find encouraging. Yes, having one family displaced is troubling, but I think leaving our codes the way they are today are not the right direction. There were a lot of also kind of people in the community who had asked us after the work that we did to kind of open testimony yet, and I want to just quickly address that a little bit. And the reason we pushed, at least I pushed back, or leadership pushed back on doing that, is because of exactly what our goals were at the outset when we kind of came together as a commission, and seeing the analysis coming through that seemed to align with those goals. It didn't seem respectful to the community to open up testimony yet again, just to have us perhaps kind of go back and say, yeah, but it meets our goals. Maybe it doesn't meet your personal goals. So to that point, I would encourage everybody in the community to please take the time to read this proposal, to understand the proposal. You can, anybody watching this, I'm sure, has seen that it's extremely complex, the issues, and hopefully participate in the process as this moves forward to council. I think this was thoughtful work, and I think it achieves the goals that we set out to achieve. So I support the proposal and vote yes. So with that, the motion passes, the proposal passes. with a very close vote of 5-4. And I thank everybody for your participation and thoughtful deliberations.
Can I make one?
Absolutely.
Nothing to do with this. I would like to thank each of you. I have been very emotional, probably the most emotional I've been in 10.5 years on this commission. And thank you for your patience. I just thank you. And I did not point you out, Ben, to make you uncomfortable, but it's just my way. Eli, there's nothing personal. You guys are great guys. So I want to be clear, was nothing personal. It's an emotional issue about displacement. So, and Catherine, thank you for your patience. I know it's there.
Thank you for all of your input. Yes, Eli, please.
So my thanks also. I mean, I appreciate, we had a talk after the last conversation, and I think they were coming from different tools for a similar outcome, and I appreciate that we're sending a mixed vote to City Council, which will, I was sort of thinking, well, maybe we do the amendment, maybe we have unanimity. I think this is another way of conveying the same information to City Council, that of the importance of the bigger, of this anti-displacement. So I'm kind of glad this is the outcome it's come to.
Thanks. Since the floor's open, is there anybody else who would like to say anything? I'd like to present the opportunity. Yeah, Joe.
I'm going to keep it short. I just want to let you all know it's really an honor to work with you all, and it happens on a regular basis that I leave our meetings feeling that way. You're very thoughtful and sort of earnest and righteous deliberations. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of work for volunteers, so thank you.
Thank you. With that, we are adjourned. Do it again.
It's going to do it again.
Is it?
Watch. Yay!
Just keep it there.
I will.
Does anybody see our cookie? Oh.